If we stand at the threshold of John Locke's philosophy, we are crossing from a world of grand assertions about authority into a quieter space where the mind's beginnings and the habits of experience begin to negotiate with power and law. To enter Locke's thought is to walk through a corridor of revolutions, intellectual, political, and personal, that bend toward a new credibility for ordinary human beings. Locke did not arrive ex nihilo with a single, tidy system. He moved through a life shaped by civil strife, exile, scientific ferment, and a restless inquiry about how knowledge begins, how it travels, and how it should guide a life that is at once personal and communal. The story begins with a life, and that life is inseparable from the milieu that made the life legible to those who would later read him as a mediator between old authority and new methods. The biography that frames Locke's ideas reads like a map of 17th century England in miniature. He was born in 1632 at Rington in Somerset, a time when England was still negotiating the long aftershocks of the Reformation and the wars of religion. His father had been a small property owner and village lawyer, an upbringing that gave young John a sense that law and property were more than abstractions, that the texture of ordinary life was politically charged and morally consequential. He found his way to Westminster and then to Christ Church, Oxford, where he absorbed the prevailing currents of scholarly life. Oxford then was a place where scholastic training and the new wave of experimental curiosity coexisted uneasily, a tension that would become the crucible for Locke's own approach to knowledge. He studied medicine with a wary curiosity about how the body and its experiences could be understood through careful observation, not merely through ancient authorities. In the 1660s, he aligned himself with the political circle around Anthony Ashley Cooper, the early Earl of Shaftesbury, a leadership figure of the anti-absolutist Whig tendency within a courtly world that retained its own reverences for order. To speak of Locke's biography is to speak of the English Civil War's aftershocks and the political tumult that followed. He lived through a time when questions of sovereignty, religion, and the authority of the crown collided with the rising claims of Parliament and the English people. The Civil War era created a habit of asking, what grounds do we have to trust rulers and laws if both might betray the very protection they promise? Locke did not merely observe these debates. He found himself entangled in them as a physician and an advisor who believed that practical arrangements, educational practices, religious toleration, civil peace, rested on how one explains the source of human knowledge and how one structures political power so that trust and liberty might endure. This is where the biography's second major thread appears, the exclusion crisis and the wave of political writing that culminated in the Glorious Revolution. The late 1670s and early 1680s were a fever of pamphleteering, a climate in which arguments about who could inherit the crown became arguments about who ought to have a say in how the crown governs. The central fear was not merely about who would rule, but about what kinds of claims to authority and legitimacy would be allowed to pass as public reason. Locke stood in that climate as a keen observer of how political arguments succeed or fail when they meet the test of practical consequences. He did not publicly take the helm as a political leader in those years, but his enduring concerns about government, liberty, and toleration found expression as a quiet, stubborn insistence that power must be answerable to the interests of civil peace and the protection of individual rights. In the heat of political upheaval, Locke found himself compelled to leave England. In 1683, after the dust of the exclusion crisis had settled in a fractured way, he departed for the Netherlands. This exile was not simply a matter of personal safety. It became the condition that allowed him to write in a climate of relative freedom about toleration and civil government without the immediate pressures of courtly censorship. The Netherlands of the late 1680s was a gathering place for refugees, scholars, merchants, and political thinkers who had grown skeptical of absolutist claims and who believed that religious liberty and civil peace were not merely matters of private conscience but of public life. In Amsterdam and Breda, Locke moved among a network of like-minded thinkers, translating his experiences in England into arguments that could travel beyond national borders and into the still emerging conversations about human rights and constitutional government. This period of exile is also the hinge through which Locke's later influence begins to be felt in wider European debates about religious liberty and toleration. It is not an exaggeration to say that many of the debates about what counts as legitimate religious practice, what must be tolerated within a political community, are shaped by the kinds of reflections Locke would publish after his return to England. It is here in the Netherlands that he begins to shape his most enduring political and epistemological claims, claims that would later be read against the grain of royal prerogative and revived by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The revolution, in turn, returned him to a country that was anxious to fashion a constitutional settlement that would limit arbitrary power while preserving the stability demanded by a society emerging in the scientific era. Two key episodes illuminate how these events shaped Locke's aims. The first is Locke's engagement with religious liberty, crystallized in a letter concerning toleration, written during a period of political uncertainty but published after his return in 1689. The letter is not a mere footnote in his career. It is a compact manifesto about who the state should tolerate and why, about how a polity can remain coherent while accommodating diverse beliefs. The second episode is the publication in 1689 of the two treatises of government, which would produce a quietly radical reshaping of political theory. Not an attack upon monarchy as such, but a defense of liberty, property, and the social contract as the legitimate ground of civil peace and political order. In these works we can see how the events of Locke's life, the threat to religious liberty, the upheavals around succession, the preference for a constitutional balance, were not external history only, but a set of pressures that refined his method and his aims. If we turn then to the context that gave Locke his clarity, we must situate him in what we might call the empirical rationalist dialogue of the 17th century. The intellectual milieu around him was not a single doctrine, but a vibrant exchange among rival schools and institutions that often agreed on ends but diverged on methods. Francis Bacon had already insisted that knowledge is not a possession but a practice, the disciplined cultivation of information through observation, experiment, and an ongoing critique of received authority. As Bacon put it, the pursuit of knowledge is a form of power employed for the betterment of human life. The Latin maxim often associated with him, ipsa scientia potestas est, knowledge itself is power, summons the mind to see science as a form of governance, a way to increase the solidity and reliability of everyday life through reliable understanding. Locke may not have always agreed with Bacon's program in every detail, but he inherited a methodological confidence that to understand the world you must begin with experience, not simply with inherited rule. In the same period, René Descartes pressed in a different direction. Descartes began with doubt as a method for discovering certain knowledge, turning inward and buffering assumptions with a rational clarity that he believed could never be undone by the senses' misdirections. If Bacon's experiment signaled faith in outward experience, Descartes' method signaled faith in inward, clear reasoning as the sure ground of knowledge. Locke's own work can be read as a patient attempt to fuse these lines. To insist that reliable knowledge begins with experience, while nevertheless acknowledging that the mind's operations, the way ideas are formed, organized, and tested, are not a mere passive receipt of data but a reflective activity that must be examined. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, offers another crucial anchor in this historical moment. It was more than a club of gentlemen with microscopes. It was a formalization of a collective project to promote experimental inquiry and to make knowledge a communal pursuit. The Society's emphasis on reproducibility, observation, and method provided an institutional home for a posture that Locke's generation found compelling. That knowledge is a communal venture, refined by debate, cross-checking, and the slow alignment of theory with tangible outcomes. The Society's ethos helps explain why the shift from authority to experience did not merely entail a personal inward journey. It entailed a public culture in which claims could be tested, debated, and adjudicated through observation, argument, and the slow drift of consensus toward reliability. At the same time, the period produced a robust rivalmanship of theories about human nature and political authority. René Descartes offered a rationalist worldview in which certain ideas could be known innately and apprehended through the discipline of method and the clarity of reason. Thomas Hobbes offered a rival political theory that insisted human beings, left to their own devices, would fall into a war of all against all, requiring a leviathan to impose order for the sake of peace. Isaac Newton would come to symbolize, perhaps more than any single figure, the unity of empirical inquiry with mathematical representation, showing how a robust physics could be built upon careful experiments and the careful interpretation of data. The broader via media of 17th century political theory, the place in which Locke's own ideas would interact with competing understandings of sovereignty, legitimacy, and the state, meant that Locke's epistemology could be read as the foundation for a political theory that was both liberal and careful about the conditions of civil society. In this environment, Locke's methodological commitments, his move from authority to experience as the basis of knowledge, took on concrete forms. He argued for a discipline of the human mind that could resist superstition, dogma, and ungrounded authority. He insisted that the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, a phrase that would echo through centuries to come as a powerful image of potential, not a claim that the mind is always empty, but a recognition that all knowledge requires shaping. The famous opening lines of the essay concerning human understanding reflect this posture with memorable clarity. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we are told, a blank page, void of all characters, without any ideas. The idea here is not a complaint about the mind's incapacity, but a pledge that what follows will be built from the mind's own experience. An invitation to trace ideas back to their sources in sensation and reflection, rather than to an appeal to innate authority. From the outset, Locke distinguishes between impressions and ideas. Impressions are the raw materials of experience, our senses giving us colors, sounds, textures, tastes, and the motions of our body in response to the surrounding world. Ideas, by contrast, are the mind's mental images of those impressions, the pale copies that we can recall, combine, or reflect upon when we are not in the midst of sensation. It is in this distinction that Locke's epistemology gains its power to explain both how we know and how we can be mistaken. He insists that all our ideas are derived from experience, either directly through sensation or indirectly through reflection on the mind's own activities. The mind, in this sense, is not a theater where innate forms pre-exist. It is a workshop where simple ideas, those that come directly from sensation or reflection, are the building blocks for a lifetime of more complex ideas. The distinction between simple and complex ideas further clarifies how knowledge accumulates. Simple ideas are the mind's first, uncomposed entries from experience. They are the building blocks: colors, tastes, sounds, the feeling of heat, the idea of unity, the notion of extension. Complex ideas are formed by the mind's powers of composition. The mind links simple ideas together to form ideas of substances and modes, relations and qualities. The mind's activity, through operations such as combination, comparison, and abstraction, yields a richer world of understanding from the same reservoir of experience. Locke's theory of language emerges here as well. Words are signs for ideas, not for things in themselves. The same word may stand for different ideas in different minds depending on education, culture, and context. And because language plays such a central role in how we think, misalignment in language can cause error to flourish. An essential portion of Locke's epistemology concerns the capacities and limits of human memory, especially as it bears on personal identity. He recognizes that memory is fallible, yet he treats memory as central to what we mean by selfhood. The memory we can bring to bear on a chain of past experiences is what allows us to say, in his words, that we are the same person across time. Memory becomes the test and the anchor of identity. This approach involves a subtle but important shift away from a simplistic notion of identity as an unchanging material substance. Locke's claim that personal identity is not a matter of the sameness of a substance, but of the sameness of consciousness and the ability to remember, that unsettles appeals to a rigid metaphysical substance and opens space for a more flexible, experience-grounded form of selfhood. To understand the significance of memory for identity, consider Locke's imagined test cases, which he uses in part to illuminate the dependence of identity on memory. If a person can recollect past actions, sensations, or thoughts, and can connect them to the present, then the continuity of consciousness that matters for personal identity remains intact. If, however, memory fails to reach back to certain past actions, the continuity is broken in important ways. This emphasis on memory as the criterion of identity invites us to imagine philosophical scenarios in which memory is transferred or obscured, raising questions about whether a person's identity could survive under such transformations. The result is a theory of personhood grounded in cognitive continuity rather than in a naive, unexamined endurance of substance across time. The upshot is that the mind's most intimate sense of itself rests on the ability to remember, reflect, and relate past experiences to present awareness. Locke's empirical commitments thus issue in both theory and life. They are not abstract, they have direct implications for how education should be organized, how religious communities should function, and how political authority should be legitimized. If knowledge begins with experience, then education should be structured to expand the repertoire of experience in ways that cultivate rational judgment, critical reflection, and freedom from superstition. If language shapes our thought, then instructing youth to use words carefully and to question the meanings that words carry becomes a political act as well as an educational one. If the state's authority rests on the consent of the governed and on the protection of life, liberty, and property, then the governance of a community must recognize the limits of coercion and the necessity of toleration for a peaceful, flourishing society. And if memory grounds personal identity, then a society that neglects the continuity of individual lives, through neglect of education, through persecution, or through arbitrary rule, undermines the very trust that makes civil life possible. Before we map Locke's epistemology in detail, let us anchor him more explicitly in the action of his century by returning to two stark, practical anchors, two historical anecdotes that illuminate the stakes of his ideas and make the abstractions come alive. First anecdote, Locke's exile in the Netherlands with its quiet, careful politics of toleration. When the storms of political upheaval moved him across the North Sea, Locke did not abandon England as a project or its possibilities. Instead, he carried England's questions into a forum where religious liberty and civil peace could be debated with a certain freedom. In the Dutch Republic, he contributed to and absorbed a culture that was actively negotiating the boundaries of religious liberty, the toleration of dissenters, and the limits of state power over conscience. The result would be a continuous thread in his work, the conviction that civil life must make room for divergent beliefs, not by coercion but by reasoned and generous deliberation. The letters concerning toleration, written during or soon after his time in the Netherlands, are not merely the product of exile. They are the crystallization of what it means to think seriously about what the state owes to its citizens and what conscience owes to conscience. Locke's argument is that the civil magistrate should not use force to compel belief, and that the church should not use coercive power to regulate conscience. The world Locke returned to after the Revolution would be a place where this logic could be implemented with a new constitutional seriousness. In Locke's language, the defense of toleration is not a call to indifferent or anarchic pluralism. It is a carefully argued stance about the conditions under which peace and cooperation can flourish within a commonwealth that remains free enough to permit the flourishing of different religious and philosophical commitments. He wrote with a sense that the liberty he defended was not purely private, but a public good that serves the stability of the state and the moral development of its citizens. His Dutch sojourn and the ideas he formulated there became a seed that would grow in the climate created by the Glorious Revolution. They are a reminder that the problem of authority and belief is not purely theoretical. It has human consequences. It affects the safety of dissenters, the protection of minority views, and the possibility of a political order in which people can live without fear that their consciences will be crushed by the force of an intolerant polity. Second anecdote, the environment surrounding the exclusion crisis and the wave of political writing that culminated in the Glorious Revolution. The exclusion crisis was a period of intense political maneuver and pamphleteering about whether the Catholic James, Duke of York, should be barred from the throne. The crisis was less about the immediate political order than about what sorts of arguments count as legitimate political reasoning. The debates of the period helped to erode the old assumption that monarchy carried with it unquestioned legitimacy and that the law's ultimate source was the divine right of kings. The political literature of the day, pamphlets, essays, and treatises, sought to articulate principles that could justify a new balance between the crown and parliament, between the executive and the people, and between religion and civil life. Locke's own work arrived into this climate as an intellectual ally of the most reformist tendencies, offering a theory of government grounded in the consent of the governed, the protection of natural rights, and the necessity of civil power's limitation to preserve peace and liberty. The Revolution of 1688, which ultimately placed William and Mary on the throne, was not a mere event of dynastic change. It was a practical vindication of the strategic idea that political authority must be bound by certain principles grounded in reason, experience, and human rights. Locke's two treatises would become a document that the generation after would read with new seriousness, a blueprint for liberal constitutionalism that sought to secure the property and life of the citizen within a legal framework that respected consent, toleration, and the rule of law. The way Locke's epistemology and political theory intertwine is not accidental. He sees the mind's beginnings as the foundation for a political order that depends on citizens' ability to think, to judge, and to participate in governance. If knowledge begins with experience, then education becomes the citizen's training ground for the life of democracy. If the mind's ideas are formed by reflection on sensation, memory, and the mind's own operations, then government must foster a culture of inquiry, debate, and critical inquiry into the grounds of authority. If language shapes thought, then the Republic must cultivate a public discourse that uses terms with care, that avoids the barbarism of fixed dogmas, and that respects the capacity of diverse communities to contribute to a common life. These are not abstract connections alone. They surface in Locke's own life, in the decisions he made, in the topics he chose to write about, and in the audiences he sought to address. Let us now turn to the central threads of Locke's epistemology and map them in more detail, keeping in view the influences and the counterforces that shaped him. We begin with the two great divisions that structure his theory of knowledge: the origin of ideas and the way the mind organizes those ideas into the world we experience. First, the provenance of ideas. Locke famously declares that no man's knowledge extends beyond his experience. This is not a throwaway line, but a radical reorientation of epistemology, one that challenges the long-standing habit of appealing to inherited authorities or to what God has written in the mind from birth. The epistemic starting point is experience, what we sense and what we reflect upon when we consider that sense. If the mind begins as a blank slate, then all of the mind's content must come from experience. That has three immediate consequences. It requires that we explain perception as the process by which sensations become ideas. It requires that we explain memory as the repository of ideas that have been noticed and re-noticed over time. It requires that we explain how concepts emerge from the mind's ability to combine and abstract, to connect, and to generalize from the particulars the mind randomly encounters. To ground this claim, Locke divides ideas into simple ideas and complex ideas. Simple ideas are the direct products of sensation or reflection. They arrive as basic building blocks: colors, sounds, textures, the idea of motion, the idea of unity. Complex ideas are the mind's built constructions, formed by simple ideas through the mind's operations of combining, relating, and compounding. The process is not mechanical in a crude sense. It is a rational creativity within the mind's limits. Locke emphasizes the dependence on experience even in the most sophisticated cognitive tasks. A complex idea like a triangle is built from three simple ideas of a line and three angles that the mind comes to recognize through repeated encounters with shapes. A more remote example is golden mountains, an imagined construct built from the ideas of metallic luster, density, warmth, and the mental synthesis of gold and mountain into a single concept. The crucial insight is that even our most complex ideas have their sources in experience, and that their truth conditions are formed by the ways in which those experiences are gathered, interpreted, and remembered. Second, the distinctions between impressions and ideas, the mind's primary data and its secondary representations, are essential to Locke's picture of knowledge. Impressions are vivid, lively experiences that come from the outer world or from the mind's own life. They are the raw feed that drives the mind's understanding. Ideas are the mind's faint copies of those impressions, reconstituted and manipulated in memory, judgment, and reason. In this sense, knowledge is not an immediate window onto reality, but a set of images that the mind constructs from experience, and which can be more or less accurate, more or less reliable, depending on how well the mind attends to its own operations, how accurately it records data, how carefully it tracks the sources of its impressions, and how disciplined it is in avoiding the confusions that come when one substitutes authority for observation. Within this framework, Locke's attention to the senses and to the nature of reality is nuanced. He defends a distinction between primary qualities, which exist in objects independent of perception, and secondary qualities, which do not exist apart from perceivers. The size and shape of a body are, in his view, real features of the object. The color and taste are the sensations that arise in the perceiver as a result of interactions with the object. This claim is not merely a metaphysical balancing act. It is a practical safeguard against a naive reliance on appearances. It helps explain why two observers may disagree about color, but still be correct in their general concept that colors are dependent on perceiving conditions. It is also a move toward a more accountable epistemology, one that acknowledges the role of perception, the limits of human experience, and the need to test claims about the world in light of how our sense data can support them. From the origin of ideas, Locke moves to the test of ideas, how we determine whether our ideas correspond to a reality we can responsibly claim to know. Here the memory problem, an issue we return to, becomes salient. The mind's ability to compare present experiences with past experiences, to recall past events and connect them to current observations, is how we test the reliability of our ideas. The memory test becomes a kind of epistemic whistle that signals when the mind has strayed into error, either by mislabeling sensations or by relying on faulty associations. This is not merely a cognitive hygiene. It is a political and moral principle as well, because if our knowledge of the world is built on shaky memory or misinterpreted impressions, our judgments about what is true and what is valuable in life become suspect. The moral of this point is that education should cultivate a disciplined approach to memory and a habit of checking ideas against experience. The mind is a participant in truth, not a passive vessel that simply receives data. Locke's theory also has profound political and social consequences. If knowledge is grounded in experience, and if ideas are produced through the mind's operations upon impressions and reflections, then education, public discourse, and political life must foster spaces where experience can be shared, compared, and tested. This has direct implications for religious toleration and for the political order that emerges from the Glorious Revolution. The idea that liberty of conscience can be reconciled with civil peace rests, for Locke, on the premise that reason and experience can guide people toward prudent judgments when they are free to examine ideas without coercive preemption. In a polity that recognizes that many different experiences may give rise to different beliefs about what is true, the task of political governance becomes the careful moderation of difference, the protection of rights, and the establishment of a framework in which people can pursue inquiry while living together in peace. To enrich this portrait with concrete cross-references, it helps to see Locke as standing in a network of thinkers who were shaping the era's most consequential questions. Consider Francis Bacon as the rigorous proponent of empirical inquiry who urged a new confidence in the observational method, that knowledge should be organized as an instrument for the improvement of life. In a famous line that became shorthand for a whole program, Bacon wrote, in effect, that knowledge is power. The logic is practical. If we understand the world through careful observation and experiment, we can control nature, we can extend our reach, we can reduce the miseries of ignorance. Locke's own commitment to experience as the ground of knowledge is not a repudiation of Bacon's program. It is a reformulation of it for a more modest and more humane goal. Not mastery for its own sake, but understanding and the improvement of human life through just institutions. Newton's science, solidly empirical, mathematically precise, and relentlessly self-critical, provides another anchor. When Newton speaks of standing on the shoulders of giants, we hear its echo in Locke's own insistence that knowledge builds upon what has come before, refined by ongoing inquiry and debate. The language of standing on shoulders is a reminder that the cumulative, collaborative project of science and philosophy requires a community of inquirers who respect evidence and test their claims against experience. Descartes, as a foil, helps us to see what Locke's project is not. Descartes' method of radical doubt and his claim for innate ideas push Locke to articulate why experience matters, why memory matters, and why the mind's own activities must be scrutinized for reliability. Locke's critique of innate ideas is not an outright denial that some ideas might be innate in some form, but a robust claim that the mind begins blank and is shaped by experience through the senses and reflection. The contrast with Descartes clarifies Locke's own claim that even the most basic ideas are built from experience rather than preloaded in the mind. Hobbes enters as a direct political counterpoint. Hobbes's picture of the human condition, a perpetual war of all against all, favors a strong, centralized power to keep the peace. Locke's program is, in part, a reply to Hobbes. A government arises through the consent of the governed, a government not for the suppression of life, but for the shelter of a life that can be lived well. The two are engaged in a dialogue across centuries. Hobbes's fear of the state of nature's chaos makes a powerful case for a strong sovereign, while Locke's confidence in the rationality of citizens and the protective role of civil government argues for limits on power and a structure of rights that specify what government may and may not do. A later figure who helps us see the arc Locke initiates is David Hume, whose empiricism and skepticism would carry Locke's project into a more rigorous, critical mode. Hume would later challenge the certainty of the moral and metaphysical claims that philosophers of Locke's generation could defend, pushing the boundaries of what experience can justify and how beliefs are formed and maintained. The arc from Locke to Hume is thus a story about a steady expansion of the empirical horizon, from a confidence in the mind's ability to derive ideas from sensation and reflection toward a more cautious, skeptical stance about what those ideas can guarantee about the world. In this way, Locke's project does not merely rest on a set of propositions about knowledge and a political program about toleration and civil liberty. It opens a line of inquiry into how human beings know anything at all, how they organize that knowledge into useful and sustainable forms, and how a political order can be designed to respect the mind's capacity to inquire and the citizen's capacity to judge. It is not, in Locke's own hands, an invitation to abandon authority. It is a demand that authority justify itself in the light of reason and experience, and that the political community build structures, toleration, property rights, the rule of law, that permit inquiry to flourish while protecting the peace that makes inquiry possible. To deepen the sense of Locke as a thinker who binds epistemology to political life, let us turn to some concrete examples, the kinds of ideas and experiments your mind can now contemplate as you hear these words. The first example is the tabula rasa itself as a starting point for knowledge. If the mind is a blank slate, then all the knowledge we acquire must come through experience. The second example concerns memory and personal identity as a test case for how reliable our ideas are. Let us explore them in vivid terms to see how Locke's framework informs both everyday life and larger political implications. The tabula rasa as the starting point for knowledge invites us to imagine a child, a mind coming into the world with no inherited ideas or doctrines pressed into its core. The child is surrounded by sense data, colors, textures, sounds, the feel of warmth or cold, the rhythmic patterns of daily life, the language and social practices that begin as a bare encounter and gradually become interpreted. The mind in Locke's account is not a passive recipient, but a mind that forms with experience an organized map of the world. So an infant experiences a red apple, tastes its sweetness, feels its roundness against the palm, and becomes able to generalize that experience to other apples that share similar color, shape, and texture. The ideas of red, round, and sweet are simple ideas arising from sensation. The child's later capacity to combine ideas of red apple, green apple, rot, and sour is a product of the mind's own assembly of the mind's impressions. The merit of this thought experiment is not that it explains every step of learning, but that it makes visible the route from raw data to complex belief. It helps us see that education is not mere accumulation of facts, but the careful cultivation of experience. The way a teacher helps a child notice distinctions, how the child learns to recognize patterns, how the child learns to ask questions, and how memory organizes all of this into a coherent narrative of the world. Now let us consider memory and personal identity as a thought experiment with a human face. Imagine a person who can remember only what happened yesterday and not what occurred last year, not even what happened a week ago. Locke asks us to reflect on what would count as the same person through time. Are we the same if we cannot remember our childhood self, or if later events allow us to remember a notorious action but not the feeling of its happening? The memory criterion says that personal identity is the continuity of consciousness, what one can remember of one's own experiences. If one can remember performing an action yesterday or last year, then one can fairly claim that the same individual performed those actions. If memory cannot reach back, we would be tempted to call that person a different self. The practical consequence is that accountability for actions and moral responsibility tie closely to memory and to the ability to connect one's past to one's present. In a political sense, memory and identity become linked to the stability of civil life. The memory of rights, the memory of social contracts, and the memory of the public's obligations to protect each other's liberty become part of the republic's long-term self-understanding. These two concrete examples, the tabula rasa and memory as identity, are not merely intellectual curiosities. They connect to Locke's broader concerns: education, religion, and politics. If knowledge begins with experience, education must be designed to enrich that experience and to cultivate the capacity to form, revise, and test ideas in light of new evidence. In a society where ideas travel rapidly through print and conversation, a well-educated citizen is one who can distinguish a plausible claim from a mere assertion, who can imagine the consequences of different policies, who can anticipate the social effects of changes in religious toleration, and who can judge whether the state is protecting life, liberty, and property. The political application is equally clear. If civil peace rests on consent and on a rational distribution of rights, then the institutions that mediate power, the legislature, the courts, a robust executive constrained by law, must be designed to respect the mind's capacity to reason, to revise its beliefs, and to hold rulers accountable. Locke's insistence on experience as the basis of knowledge thus becomes a theory of governance, a program for education, and a philosophy that makes freedom the condition for truth-seeking rather than the reward of dogmatic adherence to a single authority. But to take this further, we must acknowledge the two major counterarguments that the history of philosophy has produced against Locke's central thesis, two critiques that come from within the rationalist and skeptical traditions, and that both remind us of the perennial fragility of a purely experience-based epistemology. First, the innate ideas critique from rationalists who deny blank slates. The Cartesian and subsequent rationalist tradition argued that the mind contains not only experiences, but certain ideas that are present at birth, or at least that are so deeply built into the cognitive architecture that experience alone cannot account for them. Descartes, for example, asserts the possibility of innate ideas and the mind's capacity to know certain truths through clear and distinct perceptions that do not require sensory input to validate them. The more pointed version of this critique is that there exist universal concepts, the idea of God, the notion of perfection, the principle of causation, that seem to appear in various cultures in ways that cannot be easily explained as derived solely from sense experience. Locke would reply that even if certain patterns appear universal, their content can still be traced back to the mind's experiences and its operations in processing those experiences. He would claim that the mind's ability to discern unity or causation emerges from repeated observations of regularities in the world, and that even if some ideas feel inborn in their strength or clarity, they originate in experience and require education and reflection to become reliable knowledge. The dispute, then, is a struggle over the source of human cognitive structure. Is structure given by birth or shaped by life? The exchange between Locke and the rationalists is not merely historical. It is an invitation to examine what we mean by knowledge itself and what standards we will use to claim that a belief is justified. Second, the skepticism about whether sense data can reliably ground knowledge. This critique centers on a question that is not merely theoretical but practical. If our senses mislead us, or if our experiences are biased by context, culture, or instrument, how can experience serve as the reliable bedrock for knowledge claims? Skeptics worry that sense data are notoriously fallible. The same object may look bigger from one angle and smaller from another. Color may shift under different lighting. Our memory may misremember or misattribute past sensations. And the mind may impose patterns where none exist. Locke acknowledges these hazards and treats them as reasons for methodological caution rather than grounds for abandoning experience. He invites a disciplined empiricism, a habit of testing ideas against a broad range of observations, of controlling for confounding variables, of seeking generalizable connections rather than isolated anecdotes. The epistemic virtue here is not naive confidence in the senses, but a deliberate practice designed to separate reliable knowledge from illusions and illusions from truth. The skeptical challenge persists into Hume and beyond, as we discover that even our best empirical theories may rest on inferences that are not as certain as we once believed. Locke's articulation helps us see how the project of knowledge can still be meaningful in the face of skepticism, by insistently tying claims to testable, experience-based grounds while acknowledging the mind's interpretive guardrails. In these debates, the innate ideas challenge and skeptical worries. Locke's work acquires its real historical energy because it does not simply reject one side or another. It offers a nuanced architecture in which experience, memory, and rational reflection work together to produce knowledge that is robust enough for practical life and open enough to revision in light of new evidence. The practical upshot is a form of liberalism grounded in empirical reason rather than dogmatic decree. If the mind begins blank, if ideas emerge from the mind's operations on sensation and reflection, and if memory anchors personal identity to the continuity of consciousness, then a political order that respects individual liberty, protects property, and fosters a public culture of dialogue and toleration is not just desirable. It is a necessary condition for an educated public to exercise judgment and for civil society to endure. As we move toward the applications of all these threads, toward education, religious liberty, and political thought, we can glimpse how Locke's philosophy operates as a living instrument for a modern sensibility. The very questions that inform his epistemology, what can we know, how do we know it, how should we live in a community that must tolerate diverse convictions, are the questions that shape the English constitutional settlement and, more broadly, the modern liberal tradition. Locke's insistence that government's end is the good of mankind, and the necessity of securing life, liberty, and property, offers a foundation for political institutions that can be justified in terms that citizens can debate and defend. The requirement of consent and the rule of law can thus be understood not merely as legal curiosities, but as practical conditions that enable experiential inquiry to proceed with confidence and civic life to flourish. Let us turn then to the implications of Locke's philosophy for education and for political thought, moving from the abstract to tangible outcomes that illuminate why this thinker remains relevant for our own time. In education, the tabula rasa model and its companion emphasis on experience have resonances in contemporary debates about how to cultivate critical thinking, curiosity, and resilient minds in a rapidly changing world. If the mind begins with potential, then education should aim to unlock that potential by exposing learners to a diverse and challenging set of experiences. It should encourage not just the accumulation of facts, but the practice of noticing, comparing, and testing experience against reasoned arguments. Locke's educational program in Some Thoughts Concerning Education emphasizes the practical formation of character as much as the cultivation of intellect. He writes about play and exercise, about the care of infants, about the need to educate children in virtue and in habits of reflection, and about the importance of forming a liberal education that can adapt to many futures. Education, in his sense, is not simply money spent on schooling. It is a lifelong discipline in which the mind learns to distinguish the true from the false, the valuable from the trivial, and the enduring from the transient. In religion and civil life, Locke's tolerationist stance becomes a political instrument in the design of public life. If the state's legitimate role is to secure the conditions under which people can pursue truth and live according to their conscience, then the control of public life by clerical factions or by coercive coercion is not merely a religious matter. It is a political hazard to peace and freedom. The letter concerning toleration, which he wrote to articulate the case for toleration of dissenting sects and for the separation of church and state to avoid religious conflict, argues for a civil peace grounded in rational respect for different beliefs. The text would, in the English context, become part of the climate that would lead to extended religious liberty, a principle central to the eventual constitutional settlement of the Glorious Revolution and to the broader liberal tradition that would come to define much of modern political life. The political implications of Locke's thought, especially his treatment of property, rights, and the social contract, feed directly into the constitutional debates that mark the end of the century and the opening of the modern era. The central argument of the two treatises, that the end of government is the preservation of property and that political authority arises by consent and can be limited by a constitution, provides a framework that helps move political life away from the arbitrary rule of sovereigns to the idea that government exists within a system of rights that citizens can claim and defend. In this sense, Locke's epistemology and his political theory are not merely adjacent disciplines. They are two sides of a single project, to explain how people come to know what is true and how they can live together with others in a polity that respects the mind's capacity to learn and the citizen's capacity to participate in the common life. The cross references to Bacon and Newton as empirical anchors, to Descartes as a foil, to Hobbes as a rival political theorist, and to later empiricists like Hume as a challenger to the authority of experience, all serve to illuminate how Locke's project becomes part of a longer conversation about knowledge, power, and human flourishing. To close, I want to return to the quiet, reflective mood in which we began, the sense that a life lived in a time of upheaval can become a source of continuity when one asks the right questions with care. Locke's life, its oscillation between England's political storms and the Netherlands' culture of toleration, its movement between medical practice, education, political theory, and natural philosophy, exemplifies a tradition that seeks to build a rational life out of experience and to build a just society out of the shared life of inquiry. The tabula rasa is more than a metaphor. It is a pledge that every mind can become an instrument of insight if it is allowed to grow from the data of experience, to check its conclusions against the test of memory and reason, and to submit its ideas to the refining discipline of critical debate. The mind, when treated as a workshop of understanding rather than a repository of inherited authority, becomes capable of distinguishing what ends are truly aligned with human flourishing, and what means are needed to secure the liberty and safety of the citizens who inhabit a common life. In that spirit, Locke's memory of a world where knowledge and power must walk together, where experience must ground our beliefs, where education must cultivate a robust and humane rationality, and where toleration must temper the passions that power can inflame, offers a living note for any contemporary listener. It reminds us that the tasks of education, law, and public life are not finished once a theory is written. They begin anew with every generation in the light of new evidence, new experiments, and new conversations about what liberty requires. And so, as we reflect on Locke before Locke, the life, milieu, and foundational epistemology, we hear a quiet invitation to see philosophy not as a distant quarry of abstract arguments, but as a practical discipline that shapes how we think, how we live, and how we choose to govern ourselves and one another. The mind, after all, is not a sealed chamber but a living workshop, and the world beyond is not a fixed monument but a field of inquiry that invites us to test and retest what it means to know, to believe, and to belong. Let me close with a handful of primary voices that still speak clearly across the centuries, reminding us of the shared roots in which Locke's project grew and its lasting resonance in our own era. First, the Lockean line in its own voice: let us suppose the mind to be, as we are told, a blank page, void of all characters, without any ideas. From this starting point, to test the strength of human knowledge, we must trace ideas back to their sources in sensation and reflection. No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience, and thus the discipline of inquiry becomes the life of the mind. The end of government, Locke writes in the second treatise, is the preservation of property, and the next step is the preservation of life, liberty, and the public peace, all achieved by the consent of the governed and within a framework of civil laws enacted for the common good. These are not separate sentences but a coherent program, an invitation to a life in which the mind and the state work together to secure a future in which inquiry can thrive without fear, and where liberty is safeguarded by the rule of law rather than by the random caprices of force. From Francis Bacon, we hear the call to method. Knowledge is power. From Descartes, we hear the call to a disciplined doubt and a clarity of thought that aims for certainty, even as Locke's method remains anchored in the reality of experience. From Isaac Newton, we hear the humility and ambition of a science that grows by building on what came before. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. From Hobbes, we hear the cautionary reminder that without order, liberty itself can become a weapon against human flourishing. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, unless a strong political order guarantees safety and the predictable rule of law. And from Hume, who would later press the empirical project to its limits, we hear the challenge that even the most secure empirical knowledge must face. How far can we justify our beliefs about causation, induction, and the social world? Locke's response and insistence on the careful collaboration of observation, memory, and rational reflection, tempered by a political program that makes space for dissent and civil peace, remains a living center of gravity for generations that would follow. In this way, Locke is not simply a figure of what came before, he is a bridge to what comes after. His life, his choices, and his arguments illuminate a path from the crisis of authority to the practice of inquiry. His biography is a reminder that ideas do not emerge in isolation. They are born in the crucible of historical circumstance and shaped by the questions of people who refuse to surrender to the old certainties. And his epistemology, his careful, experience-based approach to how we know, how we remember, and how we judge, offers a practical framework for thinking about education, toleration, and government in any age that must navigate the delicate balance between tradition and reform. So we return to the classroom of history and philosophy with a deeper sense of Locke's early contribution to a tradition that would go on to define core commitments of modern thought. That knowledge begins with experience, that memory connects past and present, that language organizes our worlds, and that political life must be structured to foster the conditions under which reasoning can flourish. This is the Locke we meet before Locke, the life, the milieu, and the foundation of a theory that would prove to be not only influential but enduring, continually reinterpreted by new generations as it meets new questions about what it means to think clearly, to live well, and to govern justly. Close your eyes for a moment and listen not just with your ears, but with the quiet, patient space inside your mind that philosopher after philosopher has called the seat of understanding. We are stepping into the world of John Locke, a thinker who invites us to lean into experience, to examine how a mind that begins as a blank page can become a map of the world through impressions, ideas, and the careful use of language. This is the terrain of an essay concerning human understanding, a work that asks not what the mind is by birth, but what it becomes through encounter, reflection, and the steady practice of thinking well about how we think. Locke is not simply proposing a theory of knowledge. He is inviting a pedagogy of the mind, a method for reading, learning, and living with clarity. And as we move through this script, we will pause at moments that have echoed through centuries, moments when the simplest observations, like a candle in a candlelit room or the way a stone feels in your hand, become gateways to large questions about reality, language, and the conditions under which we come to know anything at all. Let us begin with the structure and aims of the essay, a work that can feel like a deliberate, patient excavation. Locke writes as a physician of the mind, diagnosing how thoughts arise, how ideas are formed, and how language can sometimes mislead rather than illuminate. He is, in a sense, a midwife to understanding, helping ideas give birth to broader comprehension without forcing the birth of knowledge before the mind is ready. The essay is not a single argument with a squeaky clean conclusion. It is an ongoing inquiry that invites readers to attend to the sources of their ideas, to distinguish between the immediate experiences that strike the senses and the more abstract mental copies that those experiences produce. The aim is twofold: to free knowledge from the tyranny of inherited dogma by showing how it grows from experience, and to lay out a practical guide for education and sane inquiry, so that a person can think for themselves rather than merely repeat what others have said. Locke is famously aligned with empiricism, that school of thought that places sensory experience at the center of epistemology. Yet the essay is not merely a catalog of sensations. It is a careful map of how those sensations become ideas, how ideas are combined, compared, and refined, and how language, our most flexible and most treacherous instrument, mediates the relationship between what is and what we talk about. In this sense, the essay has a practical heartbeat. It asks not only what we know, but how we know it, and how we ought to speak about what we know in ways that do not mislead ourselves or others. To approach Locke's work is to walk through a series of conversations with a tradition that is already forming, an era in which science is beginning to organize itself around observation, experiment, and reason. The emergence of empirical science in Locke's time, this is the historical air in which he writes, gives his project its particular energy. He gazes out at a Europe that is expanding its curiosity, that is moving away from purely theological or scholastic explanations, and he asks, what are the conditions under which understanding can be secure enough to guide action, teaching, and policy? Now, to the central distinction that anchors much of Locke's argument, the sharp line between impressions and ideas. Impressions are the lively, forceful experiences that come to the mind with vigor and immediacy. They are the sensations as they first strike the senses or the passions that stir within. An impression is real in the moment of contact. The sting of cold, the brightness of light, the sound of a bell, the thrill of fear, or the sweetness of honey. If you touch something hot, the immediate sensation, the feeling that travels along your nerves, is an impression. If you hear a voice, feel an impulse, see a color, these are impressions in their most direct sense. Locke insists that all our ideas ultimately arise from these impressions, either directly as the idea of a thing we have experienced through sensation, or indirectly as the mind reflects on those experiences and thus forms ideas from them. Ideas, by contrast, are the mind's copies or representations of these impressions. They are what the mind builds when it turns inward and contemplates what it has felt or perceived. An idea can be vivid or faint, simple or complex, depending on how the mind combines or abstracts from the raw material of impressions. To speak plainly, if an impression is the lightning strike of sensation, an idea is the afterglow, the memory, the image, the concept that lingers, or the bundle of thoughts we assemble when we try to explain what we have learned. The mind, in Locke's careful economy, is not born with a full treasury of ideas. It is a workshop in which simple ideas are the bricks and complex ideas are the buildings those bricks help to construct. The process is not mysterious once we attend to it. The mind receives simple ideas from sensation or reflection, and then, through various operations such as combination, comparison, abstraction, and agreement, it fashions complex ideas. And here is one of Locke's most famous images, a metaphor that opens to us a deeper understanding of his claim about the mind's beginnings. The mind is a blank page, a white paper upon which experience writes. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we would have it, white paper. The facts of experience, the facts of life in a world of solids, colors, shapes, and motions, begin to imprint themselves upon that page, and the page becomes a record of what has been, a field of ideas awaiting further shaping by the reader. In this structure of impressions and ideas, the wax candle becomes a little theater for philosophical testing. Picture a candle in a room, its wax softening as heat fades in or away, its smell and color changing with the flame's flicker. When you first look at the candle, you observe certain agreeable sensations: the luminous glow, the smooth texture of the wax, the faint scent of melted beeswax released by heat. These are impressions, vivid, immediate, and compelling. But as the candle continues to melt, the world of outward sensible qualities shifts. The candle becomes smaller, the wax deforms, the scent becomes richer or thinner as combustion changes the material. What then does the mind say about the candle as a thing that persists through change? Locke asks us to consider that the mind, aided by memory and the power of abstraction, maintains a certain sense of substance that endures beyond the changing qualities. The mind perceives through experience that there is something underlying the surface variances, an unseen substance that we call wax, a word that refers to a collection of real properties that stubbornly persists through alteration. The wax candle example is not simply a demonstration of how we know objects. It is a demonstration of how the mind goes beyond direct sensory qualities to infer substance as the continued bearer of those qualities. The candle in melting tests not just our senses but our assumptions about continuity, persistence, and identity across time. In that sense, Locke is warning us that to know substance is not to glimpse something purely in sensation, but to recognize how the mind drapes and unites disparate impressions into the coherent story we tell about a thing. From this wax example, we move smoothly into the analysis of how ideas are formed from simple and complex components. The simple ideas, Locke notes, are the ones that come to us immediately from sensation or reflection. A simple idea is like a single note, a straight line, a raw color or taste. It is not that these ideas are inadequate, rather they are the building blocks, units that cannot, by analysis alone, be decomposed into simpler ideas within that mind. But when the mind begins to mix, compare, unite, or distinguish those simple ideas, it creates complex ideas. A bouquet of color and sound, a shape and motion, a cause and effect, a virtue or vice, all of these are complex ideas assembled from simpler ones, sometimes by aggregation, sometimes by abstraction, sometimes by the fancy of the mind that seizes on relationships. Locke's analysis echoes a kind of cognitive archaeology. We dig through experience to find the bricks, and then we observe the way the bricks can be arranged into sentences, objects, and theories. He is not denying that experience is the source of knowledge. He is clarifying how that experience is processed to yield the knowledge we think we possess. Let us linger on the role of language in shaping thought, a topic that Locke treats with unusual frankness for his time. Language, he says, is a system of signs that we use to stand for ideas. Words are signs for ideas, and ideas are the copies or representations of impressions. This sign relations framework is not merely a matter of semantics. It has practical consequences for how we think, learn, and communicate. Our words, especially abstract general terms, can shape what we find it possible to think about. When we use a term like justice or virtue, we are invoking a cluster of ideas that may diffuse across minds in slightly different ways. The danger, as Locke warns, lies in confusing words with things themselves. To say that we know something because we have a word for it, or to rely on a rhetorical sign as if it were a thing itself, is to invite confusion. Language is a powerful tool to communicate and to sense what we know, but it can also mislead if we forget that words are signs that point to ideas, not the things themselves. This is why Locke emphasizes the discipline of careful analysis in education and a cautious use of general terms. To ground these considerations in more concrete terms, we must return to the famous distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Locke begins to draw a distinction that will echo through modern science. The primary qualities are those that, in a sense, belong to the object itself. They include motion, figure, extension, and solidity. The key claim is that primary qualities exist in the object regardless of whether any observer is perceiving them. They are part of the object's real structure, and our ideas of these qualities are the mind's direct copies of those structures. The secondary qualities, by contrast, are those powers of objects to produce sensations in a perceiver. They include color, taste, sound, and smell. These are not properties that exist in the objects in the same way as, say, a cube's dimensions or a ball's mass. They are the product of the interaction between object and observer. The same object can present different secondary qualities to different observers because perception is a function of the observer's sense organs and nervous system, as well as the object's offerings. In the wax candle, we are invited to observe how the candle's color, scent, and sheen can change with temperature or lighting, while its length, breadth, and shape, the primary qualities, remain tied to the material's physics structure. We can feel the wax's mass, measure its dimensions, and speak about it in terms that no longer rely solely on immediate perception. The candle thus becomes a test case for the broader epistemic claim. There is a boundary between what the senses tell us about the world and what the world itself is in its most robust, objectified sense. Locke's account meets two major lines of critique. The first is the rationalist challenge that there are innate structures of mind that shape or even determine the content of our ideas. The rationalists think Descartes, Leibniz, and others argue that some ideas or principles are built into the mind by nature, not by experience alone. They point to the necessity of certain truths, mathematical principles, geometric propositions, or the idea of causality, as evidence that the mind supplies a priori elements to knowledge. Locke's response to this challenge is to insist on the primacy of experience, yet not to deny that the mind uses certain operations, like comparison, abstraction, and combination, that feel somewhat universal. He grants that the mind possesses capacity, but he insists that the materials of knowledge come from sensation and reflection, and not from some prepackaged, pre-supplied store of innate ideas that determine what we must think about the world. The dialogue with rationalists remains an energizing tension in the history of philosophy, and Locke's insistence on experience as the source of ideas spawns a sustained debate about whether the mind truly is a tabula rasa, or whether it arrives with built-in structures that guide interpretation. The second major critique arises from the later Kant, who argued that certain a priori forms shape all experience, and that the mind contributes necessary structures to make experience possible. Kant's claim that space and time are not properties of the external world, but forms of intuition through which the mind organizes perception, is precisely the kind of challenge Locke's framework must meet if it aims to account for the conditions under which knowledge is possible. Kant suggests that even our most basic experiences are already structured by the mind's own architecture, which means that some knowledge emerges not merely from passive reception of impressions, but from active preconditions of experience. Locke would respond by reopening the task. If the mind imposes organization on impressions, what are the limits of that organization, and can we still claim that all genuine knowledge arises from experience? This is not a small dispute. It is a conversation about the human capacity to know and to discipline our thinking in a world that offers impressions in streams that can be organized in countless ways. Let us step into the historical anecdotes that illuminate Locke's world. The growth of empirical science in his era was not merely a gust of curiosity. It was a structural shift in how people understood nature, calculation, and the social order. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw the Royal Society's ascent and the broader culture of experimental philosophy that valued observation, replication, and the careful comparison of competing claims. Locke moved within circles that included natural philosophers who were testing theories of matter, motion, and the powers of matter to interact with each other. He read, debated, and learned in a climate where coffee houses and laboratories were becoming the common rooms of reason. It is not an accident that the essay's insistence on experience, carefully gathered and organized, becomes a model for scientific method. In Lockean circles, one encounters a shared sense that education, conversation, and reflective discipline matter for the growth of knowledge. The empirical impulse that informs his argument is not merely a dry epistemology. It is a normative stance about how to live as a thinking person in a community of inquiry. There is another historical thread that runs through Locke's life, his influence on early education theory and polite society. The own man's practical aims in education, habits, character formation, the shaping of memory and attention, become central in his later treatises and essays on education. When Locke writes about training the mind to distinguish between ideas, to keep clear the boundaries between impressions and ideas, and to shape the habits of careful inquiry in young learners, he is giving a practical program for a society that values reason and the capacity to manage one's beliefs. The famous work Some Thoughts Concerning Education emerges from this environment, with its emphasis on gentle nurture, the formation of moral character, and the shaping of the rational capacities that school and family can cultivate. These are not abstract claims. They are calls to build an educated citizenry who can navigate the complexities of early modern science, politics, and culture by means of sound reasoning and disciplined language. The anecdote of Locke in the everyday world, teaching a child to distinguish between a real object and a sign of that object, guiding a student to remember not merely facts but the causes and relations that connect those facts, offers a glimpse into how his theory translates into a living pedagogy. Locke's influence did not end with his own time. The thread that runs from his essay to later empiricism, Berkeley and Hume, shows the way an idea can be refined, sharpened, or reframed across generations. Berkeley's idealism then takes Locke's empiricism and questions the reality of material substance by arguing that what we call existence is inseparable from perception. Hume carries the torch even further, casting doubt on the concept of causation and the sustaining of constant conjunctions that would underwrite the more robust claims of knowledge about the external world. In their hands, Locke's basic claims, experience as the source of ideas, attention to impressions, careful use of language, become a launchpad for more intricate puzzles about perception, reality, and justification. The Newtonian model of science, the insistence on observation, mathematical reasoning, and reproducibility, provides a powerful exemplar for Locke's program. The empirical method, with its emphasis on data, experiment, and explanation, mirrors Locke's emphasis on sense experience as the fountain of knowledge and on the mind's operations that transform that experience into understanding. Yet the conversation with modern rationalism and scientific method remains ongoing, and Locke's legacy invites us to consider how his framework interfaces with contemporary concerns. One set of cross-references is to the broader rationalist-empiricist dialogue that runs from Descartes to Kant and beyond. Locke's insistence that all ideas originate in experience is a strong anchor for the empiricist tradition, and he is frequently cited as a foundational figure in the rejection of innatism. Still, the line from Locke to Kant reveals a shared sense that human cognition is not a passive recorder of impressions. The mind actively organizes, structures, and interprets what it experiences so that it can achieve understanding. In this sense, Locke's project is not simply about a catalog of human ideas. It is about the conditions under which the mind becomes capable of utility, memory, language, education, and the ability to live well within a community. His reflections on the ethics of belief, though not named in the same way as contemporary discussions, foreshadow modern discussions about how we should manage our commitments to truth, how to revise beliefs in light of new evidence, and how to present arguments with intellectual humility. Let us bring in a few more anchor points that illuminate the thread of Locke's thought through the centuries. Consider Newton and the scientific method as an exemplar of knowledge grounded in experience. Newton's experiments and his careful theorizing about motion and gravitation provide a living model of how empirical data can be organized into robust, predictive laws. Locke would likely salute the Newtonian habit of distinguishing data, sensations, and measurements from the form and structure that understanding places on those data. The modern scientist can read Locke as an invitation to keep those two tasks, collection and interpretation, distinct yet intimately connected. And if we turn to Berkeley and Hume, we glimpse a refinement of Locke's program. Berkeley's critique of material substance pushes us to question what we mean by existence beyond sensation, while Hume's radical skepticism about causation and induction lands in the same territory where Locke had urged caution about how we infer stability from a stream of impressions. The conversation across generations, with Locke as a central turning point, reveals how a single cradle of ideas can be reinterpreted, extended, and sometimes unsettled by those who come after. The modern interpretations of Locke continue to resonate in classrooms, in debates about education, and in discussions of how language shapes thought. One way to approach this is to see how Locke's ideas translate into practical pedagogy. His insistence on the incremental construction of knowledge from simple ideas to complex ones becomes a template for curriculum design. Give students access to clear, concrete experiences from which they can extract simple ideas, then guide them in combining and abstracting to form broader concepts. His cautions about the power and danger of language encourage teachers to cultivate precise definitions, to distinguish between signs and things, and to foster the habit of asking what a term actually refers to before capitalizing on a generalized claim. The ethics of belief, which is implicit in his careful, methodical approach, examine the source of your ideas, seek evidence for your conclusions, and remain open to revision, offers a compass for intellectual life in the 21st century. In an age of information overload, Locke's call to slow down, to examine the sources of our ideas, and to align our beliefs with the evidence we have gathered remains a compelling stance for scholars, policymakers, students, and curious laypeople alike. Let us lift two concrete illustrations that ground Locke's theory and connect to modern sensibilities. The first is, again, the wax candle, but approached from a slightly different angle. Imagine you are writing a science notebook in the candle's glow. You notice that as heat from a flame slowly warms the air around the candle, the wax drips, the wick burns, and the color shifts from warm white to a slightly amber hue. Your sense impressions register the change, but your mind, trained by experience, detects a pattern. The object remains candle as long as the material is waxy and capable of sustaining a flame, even as the surface features wax, oxygen, and heat interact. This demonstration is more than a parable. It is a practical exercise in distinguishing between the impressions you have, what you see and feel in the moment, and the idea you form of substance as something that persists across the changing qualities. It is a disciplined inquiry. Can we know the candle's identity as a substance? Locke would shrug off metaphysical guarantees, but he would insist there is a rationally accountable inference, based on the continuity of the substance through time and the coherence of its properties, that supports our ordinary belief in the candle's persistence. The experiment is not foolproof. It invites both humility and curiosity. How confident can we be that what persists is indeed the same thing across transformations? The wax candle becomes a microcosm of the larger problem of personal identity, the persistence of the self through time, and the limits of our receptive faculties when confronted with change. The second example concerns the primary versus secondary qualities, as already foreshadowed. Consider the ordinary act of looking at a ripe tomato under different lighting. In bright daylight, the tomato might look intensely red and smooth. Under a dim lamp, it may appear dull, softer in color, almost purple in some tints. The texture we feel by touching, the firmness, the weight, the coolness of the surface, also shifts with temperature and pressure. Locke asks us to notice that the color, sweetness, and even the scent of the tomato depend on the interaction between the tomato's physical properties and our sense organs. These secondary qualities arise in the perceiver's mind as a result of how our senses function, not as isolated properties hopped into the tomato by some internal essence. The primary qualities, its size, shape, motion if we were to roll it, and its extension in space, are properties that the object would possess independently of our perception if we grant Locke's careful caveats about perception. The distinction is not merely a scholastic exercise, it is a window into how we approach science. When scientists measure the tomato's density, its molecular structure, its organic chemistry, they are indeed in pursuit of those primary qualities-like properties that exist, in Locke's sense, with some degree of independence from any particular observer. Yet modern science teaches us that even these primary qualities can be complex in practice. The behavior of matter at quantum scales or under relativistic conditions may challenge the old intuition that there is an unproblematic separation between what an object is and how we perceive it. Locke's insistence on this distinction remains a valuable corrective to the complacent belief that perception equals reality. It invites us to ask, what is the real tomato, and how do our senses and instruments of measurement help us learn about it? With these thoughts in view, we should consider the two major counterarguments more explicitly. First, the rationalist critique insists that the mind carries innate structures, that certain principles, such as the law of non-contradiction or the concept of causality, are not taught to the mind by experience but are pre-installed as essential features of rational life. The claim is that some knowledge could not be learned from experience alone, it must be built in. Locke responds by conceding that the mind is active and has operations that shape experience into knowledge, but he denies that those operations imply innate content. He argues that even the capacity to abstract or to generalize arises from repeated encounters with particulars. In other words, the mind's powers may be universal, but the ideas themselves must come from experience, as the raw materials that the mind then organizes. This exchange represents a broad move in philosophy, from a doctrine of innate ideas to a doctrine of innate faculties that operate on empirical content. The rationalist critique thus triggers a deeper inquiry into the nature of the mind's operations, while Locke insists that those operations presuppose experience rather than predefine its contents. The second counterargument arises from Kant, who, nearly a century later, argues that there are a priori forms that make experience possible in the first place. Space and time for Kant are not merely the way we interpret sensory data, they are the very scaffolding that makes any experience possible. Causality, unity of consciousness, and the categories by which we organize experience, these are not derived from a simple list of impressions. They are the conditions for any object of knowledge to appear as such to a subject. The Kantian insight is that even if science relies on observation, there is a deeper structural arrangement in the mind that shapes how that observation can even be understood. Locke's framework appears to be challenged by the claim that the mind contributes more than the mere organizing of sense data. The mind contributes the forms that govern how data can be combined into knowledge. Locke would likely respond by refining his definition of experience. Not all experiences are raw, and not all forms of combining ideas arise from arbitrary human invention. There may be necessary structures in our cognitive apparatus that shape what counts as experiences, but those structures themselves do not supply the data of knowledge. The dialogue with Kant, then, becomes a crucial pivot in modern philosophy. Where does the material end and the mind's organization begin? How do we know the world as it is, and how do we know it as it appears to us under the mind's own conditions of possibility? As we bring these threads together, it is helpful to think about the practical stakes. How does Locke's theory illuminate what we do with information, how we teach, and how we decide what to believe? For one, his distinction between impressions and ideas helps us track the reliability of our beliefs. If a belief rests directly on impression, then it might be more immediate but also more fragile. The mind can be swayed by new impressions or by the ways in which impressions are framed and recalled. If a belief rests on complex ideas built from simple ideas, then it has a scaffold, a method, for testing, revising, or strengthening it. The use of language then becomes a crucial tool in shaping both our thoughts and our beliefs. If words can distort or obscure, they can also clarify. Locke's pedagogy invites us to practice careful lab notes of thinking. What impression did I receive? What idea did I form? What evidence supports that idea? And how might I revise my claim in light of new impressions? Now, let us turn to two further extensions that make Lockean philosophy classroom-friendly and relevant to everyday life. The first extension concerns learning and memory. Locke treats memory as a crucial faculty that bridges the present impression and the past idea. Memory is not a simple recording device, it is an active reconstructive process. When we recall a past experience, we are not simply playing back a stored recording. We are reconstituting the past in the light of current impressions and current understanding. The reliability of memory depends on the fidelity of impressions and on the fidelity of the mind's operations, its ability to associate, generalize, and retain. In contemporary terms, Locke's analysis resonates with modern cognitive psychology's view of memory as constructive rather than perfectly recallable. We recall with interpretation, we fill gaps with plausible inferences, and we revise our recollections as new information emerges. An important classroom note follows. When teaching, encourage students to articulate the ground of their memory for a claim, to separate what was observed from what was inferred, and to be explicit about the role of interpretation in memory. It is a gentle, practical discipline that aligns with the Lockean method and helps cultivate critical thinking as a daily habit. The second extension concerns the ethics of belief. Locke's framework implies that how we form and sustain our beliefs carries with it a responsibility. If beliefs are built from experiences and carefully formed ideas, then the responsible thinker would seek evidence, examine their sources, and discriminate between strong and weak grounds for belief. The ethics of belief asks, when is it permissible to hold a belief without irrefutable evidence? When should we revise a belief in light of new impressions or more robust explanation? Locke would not demand infallibility. He would demand conscientiousness. In practice, this entails a willingness to revise one's views, to test ideas against the experiences of others, and to watch for the misdirection that language can provide. The social dimension matters as well. In polite society, where ideas travel through discourse and education, the responsibility to speak truthfully and to falsify claims with clear, well-supported reasoning takes on moral weight. The ecclesiastical and political order of Locke's time was deeply involved with questions of belief and legitimacy, but Locke's own emphasis on experience, clear language, and education offered a more humane, less sectarian approach. A call to cultivate the mind in a manner that makes belief an active, disciplined, and ethical engagement with the world. To bring this into the present with real-world applications beyond the classroom, we can consider how Locke's ideas travel into contemporary debates about scientific literacy, pseudoscience, and policy. When people try to persuade others about climate change, vaccines, or the reliability of polls, Locke's insistence on distinguishing signs from things themselves, on grounding ideas in experience, and on careful language becomes a valuable compass. He would urge us to define precisely the terms we use, to separate the impression of a phenomenon from the interpretation of that phenomenon, and to provide the evidence that supports our conclusions. In education, Locke's emphasis on simple ideas as the bricks and complex ideas, as the buildings provides a practical blueprint for teachers designing curricula that build scientific thinking from tactile, concrete examples to abstract reasoning. The wax candle becomes more than an example. It is a template for how learners can be guided to track change, identity, and persistence in a way that trains careful judgment. In public discourse, his warnings about the power of language to mislead, and his insistence on the importance of clear definitions, become a defense against vagueness, rhetorical excess, and the convenience of broad claims that cannot be substantiated. In closing, let us reflect on Locke's enduring appeal. He offers a patient, humane account of how the mind comes to know the world, a framework that respects the observer's humanity while insisting on the primacy of experience as the source of ideas. He offers a method that is as much about how to think as it is about what to think. Examine impressions, differentiate them from ideas, analyze how complex ideas are formed from simple ones, and be vigilant about the word's signification in shaping thought. He invites us to recognize that our language both enables and constrains our understanding, and that we have a responsibility to educate ourselves and others in ways that cultivate accurate thinking, honest inquiry, and charitable discourse. And in this invitation lies a quiet, almost soothing invitation to truth-seeking, to approach knowledge as a shared project of human inquiry, to attend patiently to the senses, to train the mind to form ideas with care, and to speak with precision so that our words illuminate rather than obscure, so that our beliefs are rightly formed and rightly challenged. We have walked through the core of Locke's essay, the heart of his empiricist program, and the ways in which it speaks to us today. We have heard his call to differentiate impressions from ideas, to analyze how simple ideas combine into complex ones, and to reflect on the role of language as both instrument and potential trap. We have seen the wax candle and the primary-secondary qualities as living demonstrations of his method, and we have heard the critical voices that will continue to shape the conversation, rationalists who insist on innate structures, Kant who argues for the mind's a priori forms, and successors who refine, challenge, and extend his project. We have touched on the historical anecdotes of the empirical revolution that informed his era, the coffeehouse conversations and the growth of a culture of observation, the educational reforms and the civic ideals that shaped polite society. We have made cross-references to Berkeley, Hume, Newton, and the larger rationalist-empiricist dialogue, and we have considered how his ideas echo in our own daily practices of learning, memory, and belief. If the mind is a workshop, then Locke gives us the blueprint for steady work, the patient collection of impressions, the disciplined formation of ideas, the careful use of signs and words, and the careful testing of beliefs against experience. In the classroom, in the laboratory, in the quiet hours of reading, his voice speaks not as an authoritarian decree, but as a guide who helps us become more attentive, more precise, and more responsible in how we think and how we speak about what we think. It is a venerable aim, and yet a living one, because the questions Locke raises have not vanished with the passage of time. The questions persist. How does experience shape our knowledge? How does language shape our thought? How do we distinguish what is truly about the world from what is merely about our interpretation of it? And how should we, as thinking beings in a shared human life, inhabit the space between impressions and ideas with honesty, curiosity, and care? So we end not with a final verdict, but with an invitation to continue the inquiry. Read Locke with the patient attention he invites, attend to impressions, examine the ideas that arise, test them against future experiences, and be mindful of how language can be both a bridge and a barrier to understanding. In doing so, you participate in a tradition that begins with a blank page, and through the patient work of experience and reflection, writes a map of the mind that is at once humble and expansive, cautious and ambitious, practical and ultimately philosophical. This is the spirit of an essay concerning human understanding, a disciplined, reflective, and hopeful project suitable for teachers and students, scientists and poets, citizens and friends, as we all navigate the enduring questions of what we know, how we know it, and why we choose to seek knowledge together. Imagine stepping into a thought experiment where no king sits above you and no parliament sits beside you, where every person is theoretically equal and free, yet there is no law to bind the passions that flutter inside. This is the state of nature as John Locke will describe it in the two treatises of government, not as a nightmare of chaos, but as a baseline, a moral and rational starting point from which political life must emerge. In this segment, we're not simply summarizing a dusty philosopher's heady abstractions. We're tracing a political project that reshaped how people think about government, rights, legitimacy, and the possibility of change when rulers become a threat to the very purposes they're meant to serve. We're going to map Locke's steps carefully to see how he moves from a theory of nature and rights to a theory of consent, to the idea of standing laws, to the radical claim that people may resist tyranny. Along the way, we'll hold up two concrete examples that Locke himself would recognize, consider two significant counterarguments that any political theory must face, and illuminate how Locke's ideas reverberate through history, from the Glorious Revolution to the letters concerning toleration, and into our modern debates about property, authority, and religious liberty. Let us begin with the state of nature. Locke begins with a fundamental claim about human equality and freedom, a natural condition that precedes any political arrangement. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Think about that sentence for a moment, because it is not merely descriptive. It is a moral claim about how we ought to treat one another before law is written, before kings and assemblies are constituted. There is a sense that reason itself binds us to certain duties toward others, duties that persist even in the absence of a sovereign power. We are not left to sheer brute force where might makes right. There is a universal standard, a natural law, that moral agents can discern by using their rational capacities. It is this law of nature that grounds the claim that we have a form of obligation to refrain from harming others in life, liberty, health, or property. Locke's state of nature is not the Hobbesian abyss. It is a realm where people are free and equal, where everyone has the right to judge for themselves and to act to preserve themselves and their property, where there is, at least in principle, a shared reasonableness. Yet it is also a precarious condition. Without civil society, there is no secure guarantee that I can enjoy my life or my possessions without danger from others who might infringe on me. The law of nature requires prudence, restraint, and mutual respect, but it does not automatically produce a stable peace. A thief can encroach, a strong man can impose his will, and a private injury can escalate into muttered feuds. And so the question arises, if the state of nature presents these dangers to life, liberty, and property, why not move from it to a civil society where the risk of invasion, theft, and arbitrary power is diminished? Locke's answer is that people consent to form a society precisely to preserve their property and protect themselves from the unbridled impulse of others. The transition from nature to civil society is not a surrender of freedom. It is a conversion of freedom into security, into a system of laws, and into a political order that can enforce those laws. The grand move is that consent, the voluntary agreement of free individuals, legitimizes political power. But consent for Locke is not a mere momentary act at the moment of formation, it is an ongoing condition. Those who join the social compact and those who consent to be governed by the established laws do so with the understanding that the government will protect their natural rights, their lives, their liberties, and their possessions. And if the government fails in this, if it becomes a threat to those rights, then the social contract begins to unravel. The government ceases to be legitimate because it ceases to serve its purpose. Consent is the hinge of legitimacy. Locke insists that no man can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. This is not a passive consent given once and for all. It is a continual alignment of authority with the will of the governed, expressed through the structures and procedures of civil society. If the legislative or executive branches transgress the ends of the Commonwealth, or betray the trust placed in them, the people are no longer bound in the same way. They retain the right, grounded in the very principles that justified civil society in the first place, to resist, to reform, or to replace the government. This is where Locke's theory meets a radical policy of change. The right of revolution not as a mere protest, but as a justified turning of political power back toward its foundational ends when rulers violate the trust. In Locke's account, natural rights are the core, the anchors, and the test of political legitimacy. The most famous formulation that modern readers encounter, whether in philosophy, political theory, or the rhetoric of contemporary rights debates, attests to the central triad. Locke speaks of the end of government as the preservation of property. The phrase property here isn't merely real estate in one's name or a bank account. It is a broader conception that encompasses life, liberty, and the possessions one acquires and uses in order to live, thrive, and contribute to the Commonwealth. The natural rights are not granted by the state, they pre-exist political authority. They are the rights one has by virtue of being human, by sharing in reason and the capacity for labor, and by the obligation to respect others' similar rights. The claim is bold and enduring. Government exists for the protection of these rights, not the other way around. If the government ceases to protect them, its legitimacy dissolves. Let us listen to Locke's own articulation of property as a natural right grounded in labor. The labor theory of property is central to Locke's philosophically project. The basic claim is straightforward, and it has a stubborn clarity that has made it both influential and controversial. The labor of his body and the work of his hands are properly his. The act of mixing labor with the raw materials of nature gives something a first claim to ownership that is grounded in the person who labors. In Locke's account, ownership is not simply a matter of counting numbers or of coercive enforcement. It is the natural consequence of mixing one's labor with the resources of the earth. When a person clears a piece of land, plants crops, or chisels wood into a useful form, that product bears the mark of the laborer and thus becomes his property. The claim here is not an abstract fiat. It is a description of how human beings make nature useful, take what was common to all, and secure it for their own subsistence and flourishing. But property cannot be the last word, because the earth is a common possession of human beings in nature. If every individual could expropriate without restraint, a few could take more than the rest, and the common stock would quickly diminish into scarcity, or at least into inequality that undermines social stability. To prevent this, Locke introduces the proviso: property must leave enough and is good for others. The phrase is widely recognized because it crystallizes the delicate balance between individual ownership and the common good. It is not a mere boundary line, it is a moral limit on appropriation. One may convert nature into property through labor, but one must not so grab property that others cannot also labor to sustain themselves, or that future generations will be deprived of the necessary resources to live and thrive. The proviso is an ethical constraint that tempers the raw power of labor with a duty to others. It is a bridge between personal acquisition and communal welfare, between private gain and public sufficiency. In Locke's framework, these claims about property and the state of nature feed into a political theory centered on consent and the rule of law. The social contract is not a contract among all individuals in the abstract. It is a process by which individuals enter into a political association that binds them to laws and to a political order that will safeguard their natural rights. The government emerges as a cooperative solution to the problem of securing life, liberty, and property in a world of competing interests and potential coercions. The government is thus constructed with certain limits. Locke's emphasis on standing laws, the trust placed in rulers to serve the common good, and the idea of a balance or separation of powers are not incidental features. They are essential to the stability of a political order grounded in consent and aimed at the protection of natural rights. the legislative power in particular, is not absolute in Locke's account. The legislative is bound by the end of government and by natural law, and it must govern with the public good in view, not with the aim of self-perpetuation or tyranny. This is where the narrative of Locke intersects with actual political practice and historical development. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 serves as a practical test case for the Lockean framework of consent, legitimacy, and the authority of Parliament. The revolution was not merely a party victory or a shift in dynasties. It was, in many ways, a constitutional experiment about whether government by consent could restrain arbitrary power and guarantee the rights that the social contract was meant to protect. Parliament asserted its authority, and William and Mary accepted the conditions under which they would reign, conditions that emphasized rights, liberties, and laws that bound rulers rather than subjects. This dramatic event is not merely a footnote in political history. It is a live demonstration, accessible to Locke's philosophy, that legitimacy rests on the consent of the governed and on the obligation of rulers to govern by the law for the common good. The revolution, then, becomes a historical illustration of the Lockean principle that the legitimacy of government is contingent upon its fidelity to the ends for which it exists. Locke's political program is not only about consent and revolution. It also has a robust dimension of toleration that emerges most clearly in his letters concerning toleration. This is a practical extension of the theory of consent and natural rights into the realm of religious liberty. For Locke, the civil magistrate has a defined and limited role when it comes to the conscience. The care of every man's soul is not the business of the state. The civil power cannot be entrusted with the salvation of souls, nor should it dictate the forms of worship or dictate doctrinal orthodoxy. Toleration, then, is not a purely generous virtue. It is a political necessity for the preservation of liberty and the stability of civil society. If governments were to coerce beliefs and force uniformity in matters of faith, dissent would fester, and social peace would be endangered. Locke's defense of toleration thus aligns with his broader theory of consent and the rule of natural law. People ought to be free to worship as conscience dictates, provided that their religious practices do not threaten the civil peace or the rights of others. In this sense, the letters concerning toleration embody Locke's political project as a whole, a political order grounded in natural rights, secured through consent, limited by law, and sustained by the peaceable coexistence of diverse religious communities under a common civil authority. He is not a liberal in the modern sense who champions unlimited pluralism for its own sake. He is a liberal precisely because he ties toleration to political stability, to the protection of property, and to the obligation of civil society to remain within the boundaries set by natural law. The toleration he defends is not a license to heresy at the cost of social order. It is a principle that positions conscience and religion within the private sphere, while the civil magistrate remains responsible for the external trappings of religious practice that bear on public life. To appreciate the depth and texture of Locke's argument, consider two concrete examples that illuminate his thought in accessible terms. First, the labor-based property example. Suppose a farmer clears a patch of forest, tills the soil, and raises crops. By virtue of the labor he pours into that piece of land, it becomes his property. The soil, which was once common to all, now contains a man's investment of time, skill, and risk. Locke's claim is not that mere possession makes something property, but that labor gives the laborer a rightful claim to what labor has produced. This is a morally rigorous account because it ties property to the person and to the person's work. Yet the proviso remains essential. This farmer cannot take so much that others are left with nothing that can be labored upon and made good for life. There must be enough and as good left for others. The ethical force of this proviso is to universalize the responsibility that accompanies property. It is not a call to a generic egalitarian utopia. It is a call to fairness, to a balance between individual achievement and communal sufficiency. Second, the legitimacy of government predicated on consent and bound by natural law. Locke's second example is the claim that the government's legitimacy depends on the people's consent and on the government's fidelity to natural law. Consider a constitutional monarchy or a republic in which the legislative body has constrained powers, in which the government operates under the rule of law, and in which elections are held to express consent. The point is not that consent is a one-off historical act, but that it remains the bedrock of legitimacy as long as the governing bodies govern in a manner compatible with natural rights and with the ends of civil society. If a government sets itself against the purposes of life, liberty, and property, it is no longer fulfilling its role, and the people have the right, under Locke's theory, to resist or to reform the political arrangement to restore the ends of government. This confidence in popular sovereignty, tethered to a legal framework, was a radical claim in the late 17th century and would remain a model, or at least a foil, for later liberal political theory. Now let us turn to a pair of counterarguments that any robust theory of political legitimacy must address. The first is the Hobbesian challenge. Thomas Hobbes opens his Leviathan with a stark description of life in the state of nature. A war of every man against every man, where the life of man in that condition is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He contends that without a sovereign power to impose order, fear, deception, and conflict would govern human interactions. In Hobbes's account, the state of nature is not a provisional stage that security must eventually overcome. It is an enduring condition that demands a powerful, centralized authority to prevent a descent into chaos. The consequence for Locke's framework is clear. If the state of nature is inherently insecure and dangerous to life and property, consent becomes a practical impossibility for securing stable peace. Lockean theory must explain why natural law and reason suffice to govern the state of nature, and to justify leaving it in favor of civil society when the alternative seems so perilous. Locke's answer, in brief, is that while the Hobbesian vision of perpetual conflict may have dramatic force, it is not the only possible description of human nature or the possible conditions of political life. The state of nature, for Locke, has a law of nature and a generally cooperative framework that reason can discern. It presupposes liberty and equality, but it also recognizes the vulnerability of individuals in the absence of a stable political order. The risk is not annihilated in nature, but restrained. The contract for civil government is a calculated risk, an agreement to restrain some natural freedoms in order to secure greater protection for life, liberty, and property via institutions, laws, and a system of enforcement. The Hobbesian critique is powerful, but Locke's response is to insist that civil society is legitimate only if it remains a vehicle for preserving natural rights, and if the rulers themselves remain subject to the law. The moment they fail, the social contract dissolves in the sense that the people retain the right to resist, reform, or replace. In this way, Locke preserves a channel for liberty and reform that Hobbes seems to foreclose. The second counterargument comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who challenges the Lockean account from another angle. Rousseau's celebrated claim in The Social Contract is that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. The general will is the source of legitimate authority, and sovereignty resides with the people as a whole, not with a subset that claims to speak for the people. For Rousseau, consent is more than a one-time entry into an arrangement. It is a continuous alignment with the general will, yet there is a problem. If the general will embodies the common good, does this mean that dissent is always a form of injustice or misinterpretation? And what about exclusions? Locke explicitly outlines limits on toleration in certain respects and makes clear that the civil magistrate should not coerce religious belief. But Rousseau's project raises a different issue. If consent can be given by some but not all, and if the general will sometimes reflect the interests of the dominant groups, then how can consent be universalizable and protective of marginalized groups, women, enslaved peoples, colonized peoples, and slaves? Rousseau's own language in some places seems to narrow the circle of legitimate subjects and exclude those who cannot consent in the conventional sense. The general will, while aiming at the common good, risks enshrining the particular biases of those in power. Locke's framework, when confronted with Rousseau, needs to address how consent operates in a diverse and unequal society. If we take Rousseau's problem seriously, we must examine whether the Lockean device of consent really guarantees political legitimacy in a world marked by social hierarchies, gender subordination, and colonial domination. Locke does address toleration and property, but his program leaves open questions about who counts as a political subject capable of giving consent. The letters concerning toleration attempts to carve out a space for religious liberty within the civil peace, but it does not automatically resolve the problem of political inclusion for slaves, women, or colonized peoples who are not, in Locke's terms, fully free or equal in the political sense. The Rousseauian critique thus highlights a structural tension within early liberal thought. The aim of universal liberty and equality clashes with the realities of social, gendered, and racial hierarchies that constrain the scope of meaningful consent. Rousseau's challenge is a prompt for later liberal theorists to rethink the conditions under which consent is legitimate, inclusive, and stable. To see how this all plays out in history, we can turn again to the Glorious Revolution and to Locke's own political program embedded in the broader currents of late 17th century political thought. The Glorious Revolution was, in effect, a practical demonstration of consent and Parliament's authority. It was an era when the legitimacy of a sovereign could be contested and redefined through constitutional arrangements that placed limits on royal power and elevated the role of representative institutions. Parliament's sovereignty and the insistence on constitutional checks functioned as a living laboratory for Locke's insistence that the legislative power must serve the common good and be bound by the laws of nature and by the rights of English subjects. The revolution did not merely replace one monarch with another. It transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled by confirming the primacy of consent, the rule of law, and the protective arrangements for individual rights. It created a political environment in which Locke's theories could be tested against practice. Can government be legitimate when it rests on the consent of the governed, when its laws are standing, and when it operates within the limits of natural law? The answer in the historical record is a cautious yes, so long as the governors remain accountable and the power to resist remains a legitimate option. The letters concerning toleration offer a complementary historical moment that demonstrates how Locke's theory translates into concrete policy and practice. Published in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, these letters argue that religious toleration is essential for political stability and civil peace. They insist that the civil magistrate should not compel belief, that the conscience remains beyond the reach of coercive state power, and that the civil sphere should protect outward peace while allowing diverse religious expressions to flourish under a common political framework. Locke's argument is not that religious diversity is a mere accident of history. It is a necessary condition of liberty and of social life grounded in consent. The letters carefully distinguish between civil interests and religious obligations, arguing that the state's legitimate authority is limited to maintaining peace and protecting a citizen's civil rights, not dictating personal beliefs or saving souls. In this sense, the Toleration Project is a practical extension of the natural rights framework into the domain of religious life. It is an effort to harmonize pluralism with political unity, to preserve the rights of individuals while maintaining social cooperation. If we bring these historical episodes into dialogue with later liberal thinkers, we can see the movement from Locke's ideas to the broader landscape of rights, legitimacy, and justice. Cross-referencing to Nozick and Rawls helps illuminate how the debates about rights and legitimacy evolved. Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia argues for a minimal state that is justified solely to protect individuals' rights to life, liberty, and property, and he critiques any expansive social democratic or redistributive program as a violation of the rights of individuals. Nozick's entitlement theory emphasizes acquired rights and the right of acquisition, and he is often read as a critique of Lockean property as a license for aggressive accumulation or for social regulation of holdings. Locke's property theory, if read through Nozick's lens, faces challenges about how the proviso can be reconciled with modern capitalist economies and with issues such as inequality and distributive justice. Rawls, by contrast, offers a different liberal trajectory. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls grounds the principles of justice in the original position and the veil of ignorance, asking what basic liberties and social arrangements rational agents would choose if they did not know their own place in society. Rawls's difference principle, in particular, challenges the Lockean anticipation that property and wealth can be left to natural liberty alone. Rawls would argue that a just society may require distributive arrangements that minimize the worst off, a claim that pushes Locke's framework toward what we might call a more robust social equality than his original natural rights framework would typically allow. Kant's own contribution, especially in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and the later idea of the kingdom of ends, emphasizes autonomy, rational agency, and the moral law that each person possesses as a rational being. Kant's emphasis on autonomy and universal moral law resonates with Locke's insistence on rational moral agents capable of consenting to political arrangements. Yet Kant's emphasis on universality and moral law places a stronger claim on the categorical imperative as a guiding principle for political legitimacy. There are nonetheless tensions and continuities to be traced. Locke's later liberal heirs, devoted to protecting negative liberty and individual rights, still inherit a problem that Rousseau famously calls the general will. How to reconcile individual rights with the demands of the collective good when consent is not merely a historical fact but an ongoing, living practice in a complex society. In modern democracies, debates about property rights, consent, and legitimate coercion continue to echo Locke even as they are refracted through Rawls's emphasis on fairness, Nozick's emphasis on minimal state functions and just acquisitions, and Kant's language of autonomy and universal moral law. The legacy of Locke's two treatises is thus a living, contested inheritance. It informs liberal democratic commitments to protection of rights, to the principle that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and to the defense of religious toleration as a political necessity for civil peace. It also invites critique and revision from subsequent thinkers who push the argument toward more inclusive understandings of political agency, rights, and justice. Let us now turn to a few more concrete anchors, two more real-world examples, and two more cross-references that illuminate how Locke's theory functions when pulled into the current era. First, consider the modern idea that property is not merely a matter of private ownership, but a composite of ownership, labor, and social conditions. Locke's labor theory of property intersects with contemporary debates about wealth accumulation, inequality, and social responsibility. When people work to produce wealth, what is the appropriate degree of moral and political protection afforded to that wealth? How should the state intervene to ensure that the proviso, that there is enough and is good left for others, still holds in the face of modern industrial economies and global markets? These questions push Locke's theory toward a more nuanced account of property that takes into account social obligations, environmental constraints, and the complex structures of modern economies, while still preserving the core intuition that property rests on the fruit of one's labor and that the common good must temper private accumulation. Second, consider a contemporary political landscape in which consent is continuously negotiated through elections, referenda, social movements, and institutional checks and balances. Locke's vision of government by standing laws and a government bound by natural law translates into modern constitutionalism, where the legitimacy of political power rests on the rule of law and on formal mechanisms of accountability. The right to resistance, framed in Lockean terms, persists as a historical and practical option for societies seeking to articulate the limits of political authority. We can see it in the way protests and political reforms function as a nonviolent assertion of consent and public principle, or in the way constitutional courts interpret and check executive power. The right to resist tyranny, while not unlimited, continues to function as a guardrail against the abuse of political authority, and as a reminder that a political order is legitimate only when it remains faithful to the ends of government. The preservation of life, liberty, and property. To tie the thread back to the two earlier counterarguments, two more adjustments to Locke's theory emerge in modern dialogue. Hobbes's critique remains a powerful reminder of the stakes. The fear of an unstoppable descent into conflict is not simply a historical worry. It is a living concern in times of political polarization and social fragmentation. The Lockean reply, emphasizing the law, the rights of individuals, and the possibility of reform through consent, remains a method for safeguarding peaceful governance. Yet the modern world challenges Locke to think more carefully about inclusion. Who counts as a political subject who can consent and have rights? The Rousseauian critique, focused on the general will and the exclusions of certain groups from political life, urges a more robust construction of political legitimacy that ensures not only the formal consent of some, but the meaningful consent of all who are affected by public decisions. Locke's tolerant project, while significant, must be continually reinterpreted in light of these concerns, so that toleration itself does not become merely a shield for domination or for a status quo that excludes critical voices. Throughout this exploration, a number of primary sources illuminate the path, and we ought to attend to the precise lines that Lockean text preserves for us. The law of nature, the equal and independent status of individuals, the obligation not to harm another in life, liberty, or possessions, all of these stand as anchors of Locke's reasoning. The famous claim, "every man has a property in his own person," anchors the labor-based argument for property, while the corollary that the end of government is the preservation of property frames the political project as a protective enterprise. The right of dissent or revolution, implied in consent and bound by the ends of the Commonwealth, is the practical outworking of a theory that treats political obligation as conditional upon the government's fidelity to its own ends. To give these abstract claims the feeling of lived history, we can cite those moments where words in the treatises meet real events. The Glorious Revolution tests the Lockean principle that consent and the rule of law constitute legitimate sovereignty. The Parliament's assertion of authority and the settlement of sovereignty through constitutional laws are not merely episodes of national drama. They are a public testing ground for Locke's thesis about the limits of political power and the conditions under which the people retain a right to resist those who would betray the trust. The letters concerning toleration, written in the same historical arc, place Locke's political theory into a practical program for religious life within a pluralist and contested public space. Toleration becomes not merely a personal virtue, but a political instrument for preserving the peace of civil society, by recognizing the autonomy of conscience and limiting the coercive power of the state in matters of belief. As we reach the end of this segment, we can also glimpse how Locke's ideas awakened or redirected debates about liberty in the modern era. His influence travels in a line that reaches through Nozick's defense of minimal state authority, Rawls's insistence on fairness and the difference principle, and Kant's vision of autonomy and the moral law. Each thinker, in their own way, tests, revises, or extends Locke's core commitments. Nozick's rights-based critique asks how we justify holdings and acquisitions in a world where individuals exercise freedom in the face of social obligations. Rawls's original position and veil of ignorance translate Lockean concerns about basic liberties and equal basic rights into a structured argument for principles of justice that can be universalized even in a diverse society. Kant's emphasis on dignity and autonomy complements Lockean rights in a philosophical architecture that sees individuals as ends in themselves, not merely as means to political or economic ends. The dialogue among these thinkers shows that Locke's two treatises remains a living document, a place where early modern political theory converses with contemporary questions about justice, legitimacy, property, and liberty. To close, let us return to the central thread, the political project Locke offers in the two treatises, a project that seeks to ground political legitimacy in the consent of free individuals, to limit the powers of government through laws and constitutional restraints, to safeguard life, liberty, and property, and to allow for resistance when rulers betray the purposes of civil society. It is a project that begins with the state of nature as a baseline, moves through the labor theory of property, and culminates in a vision of government by standing laws, tempered by the trust that rulers serve the common good rather than their own appetites for power. It is a project that also asks us to think carefully about toleration, about religious liberty, and about the ways in which public life can accommodate diversity without surrendering the peace that makes political life possible. And in the end, Locke's project is not a merely historical artifact. It offers a language and a method for grappling with questions that remain urgent today. How should we understand property and its social obligations in a global economy? How can a political system legitimately balance the rights of individuals with the demands of collective life? What are the proper realms of religious liberty and civil authority, and how can we reconcile pluralism with a shared constitutional order? How do we recognize and defend the right to resist tyranny while maintaining social stability and peace? These are not questions Locke settled once and for all. They are questions that continue to be asked, with the text of the two treatises serving as a resource, a provocation, and a point of departure for ongoing debates about rights, legitimacy, and the meaning of political life. So as you listen to these lines, imagine a world where the grammar of political legitimacy is built on consent and natural law, where a government's authority is measured by its fidelity to the ends of government, and where the right to resist is not a license to chaos but a sober acknowledgement that power must stay answerable to the people it serves. Imagine Locke's insistence on the proviso, leave enough and as good for others, as a constraint that keeps property from becoming a private tyranny over the legitimate claims of others to the means of life. Imagine the toleration that accompanies such a political order, the trust that conscience should be safeguarded, and the belief that peace among diverse beliefs is possible within a shared framework of laws. This is the intellectual landscape of the two treatises, a landscape that invites us to reflect, debate, and continue the work of designing political communities that respect the dignity, liberty, and reason of all those who live within them. The conversation is far from finished, and Locke's voice, measured, precise, and insistently practical, remains a fruitful instrument for those who want to understand the foundations of liberal political order and the moral duties that accompany freedom. In the quiet spaces between the shelves and the soft hum of a library late at night, the dialogue begins not as a shouting match, but as a careful, patient unfolding of ideas. The air seems to hold its breath as a voice that speaks with the clarity of centuries, a voice that remembers the rough, hopeful days when a few radical sentences about liberty could still feel like a living act of courage, meets the unquiet voices of our own time. What follows is a conversation across time, a back and forth between a Lockean understanding of liberty, toleration, and education, and the modern critiques that have pressed, sharpened, and sometimes unsettled those very claims. We listen not for absolutes but for the living tensions that keep a liberal tradition honest and responsive. Let us begin with the origins, the seedbed from which Locke's ideas grew. He lived in a world convulsed by civil war and religious conflict, where the question of who holds authority over belief, property, and the body was more than a theoretical puzzle. It was a matter of survival. The foundation of his political thought rests on the claim that human beings, in their natural condition, are free, equal, and independent, and that governments arise not from necessity but from consent, precisely to secure the peace and protection that individuals cannot guarantee on their own. The argument is stubborn in its insistence that legitimate political power requires the agreement of those who are governed. It is not that authority is merely a matter of force or tradition. It is empowered by the tacit or explicit consent of those who would be governed. The words from the second treatise ring with a certain crisp, almost surgical clarity. Men, being by nature free, equal, and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The aim, the great and chief end, is the preservation of property. What does he mean by property? Not merely land or coins or goods, but something more capacious. The secure space in which a person can live, think, and choose the course of life that seems to be theirs by original right. The famous line, often quoted, sometimes paraphrased, seldom treated as the living hinge of a complex thought, is that the end of government is the preservation of property. Locke does not pretend that property is the only good or the sole measure of civil life. He unfolds a broader case for liberty as the precondition of peace, prosperity, and personal development, a liberty grounded in natural rights that precede the state and are intelligible apart from the state. It is a bold claim that if a government erodes life, liberty, or property, if it acts against consent and against reason, then the people retain the right to resist or to dissolve that government. The recurrent word is consent, the indispensable moral currency by which a political order earns legitimacy. From this bedrock, Locke moves to the domain of religious life and conscience. He writes across the most uncomfortable fault lines of his era, the struggle to reconcile civil peace with convictions that are deeply held, often radical, sometimes dangerous to the established order. In the letter concerning toleration, the central claim is stark and to his mind liberating. The care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate. The magistrate has authority over civil matters, property, security, the regulation of public life, but not over the conscience, not over the inner realm of belief and moral judgment. Locke is clear that coercing belief is not the path to true piety or civic harmony. Coercion is a weapon of the state that corrodes the very rational basis of civil life. The heart of his toleration is not indifferentism, but a disciplined separation of church and state, a separation meant to protect the peace of the commonwealth by keeping civil power from dictating the terms of salvation. The practical effect in his own age was to widen the circle of who could live as equal subjects under a common law, even if they did not share the majority faith. And yet, the Lockean school is not a single mood, but a polyphonic conversation with itself and with what comes after. The educational dimension, in particular, is indispensable. In some thoughts concerning education, the elder and the thinker propose a pedagogy that privileges experience, habit, and the shaping of reason over rote regimentation. The education Locke sketches is not a mere transfer of knowledge, it is the formation of a rational, morally conscious agent. The child should be nurtured to think, to question, to make judgments rather than to merely follow orders or memorize a catechism of accepted truths. The aim is not the production of obedient subjects, but the cultivation of capable, virtuous, reflective beings who can participate in public life with discernment. The mind in his telling is a theater where experience is the teacher and habit the scaffolding that makes reason reliable. It is a program that anticipates, by generations, the modern insistence on critical thinking, experiential learning, and moral development as essential components of education policy. This is the core architecture: liberty, consent, toleration, and education arranged like rooms in a house that Locke bequeaths to liberal political philosophy. This architecture has produced a long corridor of influence that would lead, across centuries and continents, into the creeds and constitutions of republics and into the classrooms of modern schools. The two examples that you will see in action are not mere illustrations. They are living demonstrations of the way Lockean ideas have taken root and then been tested, revised, or resisted. First, the influence on the early American constitutional order and the Bill of Rights. The case here is thick with history and texture. The American founders stood in a long line of political thinkers who argued that government gains legitimacy only when grounded in the consent of the governed and limited by natural rights. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted in a climate of revolutionary ferment in 1776, enshrined the idea that all individuals possess certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government exists to secure those rights. The language, the spirit, and the argumentative logic of Locke, especially the insistence on consent, the limits of sovereignty, and the protection of property as a vital civil end, helped shape these Maryland and Virginia declarations and ultimately the framers who would draft the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and others read deeply in Locke. Their notes, their drafts, and their debates bear a family resemblance to Lockean reasoning. The phrase that would come to loom large in constitutional life, that political legitimacy rests on the will of the governed, that power must be constrained, that rights protect the individual against encroachments of the state, emerges in their articulate concerns with tyranny, standing armies, and the rule of law. In the Bill of Rights, one sees a pragmatic Lockean republicanism married to practical concerns about religious liberty, speech, assembly, and due process. Consider the First Amendment with its protection of religious liberty, free exercise, and the prohibition on Congress establishing a state church. Locke's toleration acts as a quiet but insistent precedent in this framework. It is better to have many voices in the public square than to permit coercive uniformity by the state. The liberty to think, to worship, to speak, to assemble, to publish, all of these are framed as civil liberties that limit government power and make possible a civil peace built not on coercion but on trust and mutual restraint. The early American constitutional order did not merely imitate the Lockean formula, it translated the Lockean problem into a modern constitutional challenge. How do you secure life, liberty, and property, understood more widely as the rights to personal security, moral autonomy, and economic opportunity, without turning those rights into weapons against the Commonwealth itself? The answer in part lies in a robust structure of checks and balances, in a separation of church and state, and in a civic ethos that treats disagreement not as sedition, but as the indispensable fuel of a healthy republic. There are living human stories tucked into this history. The historians call them anecdotes, but they feel more like the grain of wood in a living house. One anecdote concerns the reception of Locke's ideas among early American leaders and writers who inhabited the political spaces of revolution and founding. It is said that Madison studied the works that dissected tyranny and argued for limited government with a patient, almost stubborn, seriousness. He read Lockean theory with the eye of a craftsman who wanted to build a government that would endure. When he drafted notes and essays outlining a plan for robust constitutional governance, he carried into his work a Lockean suspicion of arbitrary power and a Lockean faith in the disciplined constraint of political power by law and by consent. Another anecdote concerns the way Locke's thought traveled beyond Britain, across the Channel into the European Atlantic world, and then to the American colonies. The Dutch Republic, with its own constitutional experiments and its robust culture of religious toleration, was a conduit for Lockean ideas in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Lockean letters, treatises, and the culture of argument circulated in salons, academies, and pamphlets, shaping debates about toleration, property, and the limits of state power. In this Atlantic circulation, the same ideas that argued for toleration and consent traveled together with debates about governance, trade, and empire, becoming part of the shared vocabulary of liberal modernity. Which other thinkers do we meet on this journey? The lineage is rich and sometimes contested. Mill absorbs the Lockean insistence on liberty and pushes it toward the harm principle. The only legitimate reasons for limiting individual liberty are to prevent harm to others. The exacting clarity of Mill's famous maxim, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others, derives, in part, from a Lockean concern with the peaceful exercise of rights within a social order. Kant arrives later with a different inflection, autonomy and respect for persons. In the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant insists that we must act only on maxims that treat humanity, in ourselves and in others, as ends in themselves, never merely as means. This adds a rigorous moral dimension to liberal liberty. Liberty is not a license to instrumentalize others. It is a duty to respect rational agents as ends in themselves. Nozick, taking a forthright turn, challenges the arc by focusing on rights as side constraints on state action and arguing for a minimal state whose legitimacy rests on the protection of individual rights, a stance that has been read as both a precise defense and, by some, a critique of the more expansive Lockean project. Rawls re-enters the scene by asking us to imagine a fair distribution of freedom and opportunity under the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment that keeps alive the Lockean intuition about the priority of equal basic liberties, but within a framework that acknowledges the legitimate claims of the least advantaged. If the Lockean critique becomes a larger conversation with these successors and critics, it also becomes a conversation with contemporary debates about religion in public life, free speech, and education policy. The protection of religious liberty remains a central worry in modern democracies that understand toleration not as passive endurance of difference, but as a robust, ongoing political practice that requires institutions to protect dissenting voices and minority religious positions. The free exchange of ideas is not merely a citation of rights. It is a live practice that requires institutions to be hospitable to speech even when it shocks or unsettles. Education policy, in particular, becomes a test case for Lockean liberalism in the 21st century. What is the aim of education? How do we cultivate rational, morally developed citizens who can participate in civic life with discernment and care for others? How do we balance parental choice, public accountability, and the rights of students to form their own beliefs and identities in a plural society? These questions calls for critical thinking, experiential learning, moral development, and the cultivation of character are where the Lockean legacy meets the demands and the critiques of modern life. Let us turn then to the second strand of our dialogue, two or more counterarguments that press against Locke's toleration and property theory in the name of feminism, colonial critique, and post-colonial reflection. This is not an exercise in demolition. It is a generous test, a way to see where the Lockean structure is strongest, where it is most vulnerable, and how, in response, the liberal tradition can grow more inclusive and attentive to power and history. First counterargument, feminist and colonial critiques that expose gaps in Locke's toleration and property theory. The feminist critique is not a mere grievance about gender. It targets the narrow channels through which political rights, civil liberties, and property rights are historically opened or closed to women. Locke's own text is read by some as assuming a family structure in which the husband holds a dominant position within the household, while property rights in Locke's story are anchored in labor and possession that, in practice, have often excluded women from meaningful property ownership or political voice. Critics ask, if the social contract rests on consent, to what extent can a contract be said to be binding when a large portion of the population, women in many contexts, as well as enslaved peoples and others, lacks equal standing to give consent in any meaningful sense? If toleration is the heart of civil peace, how far can toleration extend when the distribution of power in the household and in the economy remains structurally unequal? In more precise terms, feminist and colonial critics insist that a theory that rests on consent, property, and civil peace must address structural inequalities that prevent many people from giving genuine consent in the first place, or from benefiting equally from the protection of property rights that Locke stakes as central to political life. Colonial critique adds a different dimension. The property rights that Locke so reverently defends as the ground of civil government were, in many parts of the world, the legal and moral justification for dispossession, conquest, and the settlement of lands inhabited by indigenous peoples. The labor theory of property, grounding ownership in a person's labor upon land, appears to rely on a particular narrative of extraction, labor, and value that does not easily translate into a framework that respects the autonomy and rights of all peoples, especially those who experience dispossession and violence under colonial expansion. The critique does not merely bring moral questions about colonization to the foreground. It challenges the coherence of a property-centered polity that claims legitimacy on the basis of consent from a community that excludes those who have not been granted such consent. If consent is the ground of legitimate authority, who is included in that consent and who is left outside? These are not moral nitpicks inside a theory. They are structural questions about the reach and fairness of a political order that rests on property and consent. In the language of modern critique, then, the Lockean project must account for power and history. The feminist critique emphasizes that political liberty cannot be disentangled from social and economic arrangements that produce unequal access to property, education, and the public sphere. The colonial critique insists that a theory of rights and consent must grapple with historical injustices that have shaped the present. If we are serious about toleration, then toleration must extend to groups who have been historically marginalized and subordinated, and it must address the ways in which property rights have served as tools of exclusion or control. The core Lockean insight that the state exists to preserve peace and protect rights remains valuable, but the critique insists that protection must be universal and that consent must be substantive, including the voices of the disempowered in the citizenry. Second counterargument, postmodern and postcolonial critiques about power, imperialism, and the limits of consent. This critique deepens the concern that social contracts are not so much agreements among equals as arrangements forged in conditions of asymmetrical power. Without calling into question the entire project of liberalism, postmodern and postcolonial thinkers insist on reading the history of liberal thought as a history of power, of who gets to define rights, who is included in the polity, and who bears the consequences of consent. They remind us that the state's protection of life, liberty, and property cannot be disentangled from the imperial context, in which property claims often become the legal language of conquest, settlement, and control. The state of nature that Locke uses as a thought experiment is not a neutral fantasy. It can be read as a rhetorical device that naturalizes certain hierarchies and excludes others from the legitimate use of force or legitimacy of state power or the right to resist. Post-colonial critics push further by foregrounding the asymmetry of consent. They ask, consent to governance is not easily achieved when political subjects are not equally informed, not equally free to dissent, and not equally able to shape the terms by which power is exercised. The illusion of consent can disguise coercive arrangements, including surveillance, economic domination, and cultural hegemony. If consent is a social mechanism rather than an existential reality, then liberalism must reckon with how it can ensure fair participation for those who are most vulnerable to power's asymmetries. In this light, the toleration Locke champions appears not as a universal remedy, but as a form of civil peace that may still leave the subjugated in a precarious place, where their beliefs can be tolerated as long as they do not challenge the social order too loudly, or as long as they do not threaten the property and prerogatives of the dominant groups. Now, in this generous critique, we must not stunt the intellectual arc we are tracing. The virtues of Locke's thought, his insistence on consent, his defense of civil liberty against tyrannical power, his faith in the rational capacities of individuals to govern themselves, do not vanish under critique. They require instead to be reinterpreted, clarified, and sometimes revised in the light of new questions about gender, empire, race, and power. The critique is not a demolition of a stone. It is an invitation to refine a living structure so that it can bear the weight of a more inclusive modern democracy. The Lockean tradition, seen through feminist and post-colonial lenses, can be reimagined as a foundation for a more robust insistence on universal rights and on a more transparent account of the conditions under which consent is formed and rights are enjoyed. From the vantage point of these critiques, what then becomes essential for a continuing Lockean program? If the state's end is the preservation of life, liberty, and property, and if toleration protects civil peace and pluralism, then we need to ensure that the social contract, as we understand it now, includes at least three critical commitments. First, the genuine equal participation of all adults in political life, regardless of gender, race, or birth status. Second, a re-examination of property in light of historical injustices and the ecological limits of the earth. And third, a more explicit and robust account of how education serves as the engine of civic formation that can tilt the moral and political balance toward greater equality and mutual respect. The modern conversation is not a rejection of libertarian premises, but a demand for libertarian premises to be more justly distributed and more honestly exercised. The dialogue, as we have carried it so far, is not a retreat from the issue of liberty, but a deeper engagement with it. If we hold to Locke's claim that the end of government is the protection of property, we must also acknowledge that property is not a mere thing but a social practice with moral, economic, and political dimensions. If we insist with Locke on consent as the bedrock of legitimate political order, we must take seriously how consent is formed, how consent is exercised, and how it can fail to reach those most in need of protection. If toleration is the political virtue that keeps civil peace alive, we must ask how toleration operates in a society that is marked by deep pluralism, where some beliefs may demand recognition that challenges the public order. These are not trivial questions. They are the most pressing questions that accompany a living tradition that claims to respect freedom, to defend human dignity, and to foster the moral growth of citizens. Let us shift now to two concrete contexts in which Locke's ideas have been put to work, tested, and extended: education reform and constitutional law, together with enduring threads in civil rights movements. In education, Locke's influence is not merely a historical footnote. His emphasis on experience, habit, and rational formation has become a core resource for contemporary educational philosophy that prioritizes critical thinking, moral development, and the capacity to judge well in the face of misused authority. Modern education policy often wages a debate between preparing students to think and reason for themselves and delivering a standardized body of knowledge that supposedly levels the playing field. Here, the Lockean legacy surfaces in two ways. First, Locke's commitment to experience as the teacher points toward an education that privileges inquiry, observation, and the testing of ideas in real contexts. This is a pharmacopoeia of practice that resembles later pragmatic traditions of education, particularly John Dewey's emphasis on active learning, democratic classrooms, and the cultivation of reflective thinking. The idea that children should be encouraged to discover rather than memorize finds a kindred spirit in Locke's own insistence that the mind be formed through rational engagement with the world rather than through passive reception of dogma. The implication for policy is clear. Curricula should invite students to question, to experiment, and to connect ideas across disciplines, to learn through projects, problem-solving, and collaborative inquiry, to develop not only cognitive skill but the moral capacity to weigh consequences, recognize others' needs, and act with responsibility. Second, the moral development that Locke prizes, along with his emphasis on habit formation, has shaped discussions about character education, civic virtue, and the formation of a responsible citizen. If education is to contribute to civil peace by training minds capable of exercising liberty with both restraint and courage, then schools must attend to moral questions as well as factual ones. This is not a call for indoctrination. It is a call for moral formation that respects pluralism and equips students to navigate disagreement with care for others. The modern education landscape has faced fierce debates over how to balance religiously informed values with secular public education, how to cultivate critical media literacy in an age of information overload, and how to design assessments that measure higher-order thinking rather than mere memorization. In these debates, Locke's argument for tolerance and his caution about the overreach of civil authority in matters of conscience provide a steady compass. They remind us that education policy should empower students to think for themselves, to encounter diverse viewpoints, and to cultivate the capacities required to participate in a free society. In constitutional law, Locke's footprint is visible in a different register. The early American constitutional order, with its reliance on a written constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, and guaranteed civil liberties, embodies a Lockean scaffolding that continues to shape debates about the scope of governmental power and the rights of individuals. The Bill of Rights, with its protections for religious liberty, free speech, due process, and assembly, embodies a living interpretation of life, liberty, and property, where liberty is not merely about private freedom, but about the public space in which free individuals can pursue their own good while respecting the equal rights of others. Modern constitutional debates, however, keep returning to the same point. What counts as consent, what counts as property, and what is the proper scope of toleration in a plural republic? These questions arise in constitutional struggles over religion in public life, school prayer, the rights of non-believers, and the limits of state power in security policy. The Lockean frame remains a reference point, but it is not a fixed doctrine. It is a living set of commitments that must be interpreted and revised in light of new constitutional tests, ranging from digital privacy and surveillance to the rights of non-citizens and the obligations of government to ensure a more equal distribution of opportunity. To anchor these discussions with concrete cross-references, we can bring forward two lines of thought, one from the past that locks the discussion into primary authors, and one from the present that pushes the conversation into policy and lived experience. First, a few lines from the canon in which political theory and moral philosophy meet to shape liberal thought. From Locke himself, as we have noted, the grand thesis about consent. Men being by nature free and equal, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The end of government is the preservation of property. The care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate. These lines function not as simple slogans, but as prompts to continual reflection about how political communities ought to be organized and how individuals ought to live within them. From Mill, the liberty principle, the harm principle, the challenge to state power over our most intimate choices. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This line is a sober reminder that liberty carries duties, including responsibility toward others' rights and welfare. From Kant, the imperative of respect for persons. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. The moral legal demand here asks liberal politics to ensure that liberty does not become a license to instrumentalize others. From Nozick, the defense of rights as side constraints. Taxation of earnings from labor is on par with forced labor. The radical insistence that the minimal state should protect rights without using them as raw material for expansive social policy challenges us to examine where rights end and public aims begin. From Rawls, the theory of justice as fairness. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. The original position and the veil of ignorance push us to imagine social arrangements that no one could reasonably reject, given their lack of knowledge about their own place in society. These are not marginal ideas, they are the scaffolding for evaluating how a liberal society should structure liberties, opportunities, and social goods. Second, two cross-references to contemporary debates on religion in public life, free speech, and education policy. The modern debate about the place of religion in public life continues to test the Lockean claim that toleration is essential for civil peace. In a plural republic, can religious practice be accommodated in the public square without the state becoming a church? How do we protect the freedom to dissent while ensuring that public institutions do not privilege one belief system over another? Free speech remains a central node where liberal commitments meet social contest. The tension between protecting expression and preventing harm, whether to social harmony, public safety, or the well-being of others, invites a Lockean reply, but also invites Nausicaan and Rawlsian refinements. And in education policy, the push and pull between local control and national standards, the competition between experiential, inquiry-based learning and standardized testing, becomes a real-world test case for how a liberal education might cultivate not only knowledge but the virtues of civic life. Dialogical humility, respect for dissent, and a sense of moral responsibility. In this dialectical form, the dialogue grows richer when we examine two or more case studies that illuminate how Locke's ideas have lived in the world. The first case study concerns education reform in the United States and other liberal democracies. The Lockean seed of education as formation, habits of mind, rational inquiry, moral development, blooms in modern debates about curriculum, assessment, and schooling as a public good. Consider the tension between a standards-based system, designed to ensure a minimally adequate level of knowledge for all, and the Lockean ideal of education as the cultivation of rational agents capable of moral judgment and reflective decision-making. The former claims to equalize opportunity by guaranteeing a basic floor of knowledge. The latter seeks to cultivate the intellectual and moral faculties required for genuine liberty, including the capacity to critique one's own beliefs, to engage in reasoned debate, and to act with consideration for others' rights. The modern policy conversation often frames these as competing goods, equity through universal standards versus integrity of personal judgment and moral formation. Lockean ideas invite us to consider how the curriculum can be structured to reward clear reasoning, evidence-based argument, and the cultivation of temperance and empathy, not merely technical skill. They invite us to attend to how schools can become spaces where students practice the civil arts of deliberation, respectful disagreement, and the ethical exercise of freedom. The second case study concerns constitutional law, particularly debates over religious liberty and the boundaries of toleration in public life. In contemporary constitutional jurisprudence, the central questions revolve around how far toleration must be extended when the public square includes religious groups that may challenge secular norms, or when public institutions must navigate the rights of minority believers alongside the rights of others to worship, or to be free from religious coercion in public spaces. Locke's claim that toleration is essential to civil peace provides a baseline, a normative claim about how a polity should structure power and belief. Yet modern courts, scholars, and activists push the interpretation of toleration to more demanding thresholds. Whether and to what extent public prayers may privilege particular beliefs, whether prayer in public institutions constitutes establishment of religion, how to preserve the integrity of public education while respecting students' rights to hold and express diverse beliefs. The Lockean thread here becomes a route through which to assess not only the boundaries of state power, but the moral commitments of a plural society. How to balance the rights of conscience with the rights of others, how to ensure equal protection of beliefs, and how to maintain a polity in which pluralism is not merely tolerated, but cherished as a political and moral good. The third case study, perhaps the most storied, concerns civil rights movements and the ongoing struggle for equality that has shaped modern liberal democracies. The protest movements of the last century, they sought to extend the circle of consent to persons who had been systematically denied political inclusion or protection under law. The language of universal rights, emancipated from the vines of property-based privilege and extended to people of different races, genders, and sexual orientations, echoes Lockean commitments but reframes them in a more expansive register. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ+ rights movement, and other struggles have pressed liberal theory to recognize that the mere absence of explicit restriction is not the same as active inclusion and equality. They call for a politics of recognition, of equal respect, and of the moral imperative to address historical injustices that have constrained consent and opportunity for many people. The Lockean scaffolding, rights, consent, toleration, and education for freedom, provides the frame, but the content of that frame has to be filled with a more complete and more just history than Locke could have imagined. These case studies are not merely historical illustrations, they are laboratories for the living moral and political imagination. They invite viewers to engage with Lockean ideas not as relics but as tools for understanding and shaping the present. The dialogue invites you to reflect on several questions that sit at the heart of the matter. What does it mean to consent to a political order in a plural society where many voices are historically marginalized? How can consent be more than a moment of admission to a social contract that has privileged some groups over others? If the end of government is the preservation of property, how do we ensure that property rights are not hollow, exclusive, or erasing of others' rights and dignities? How can toleration be transformed from a strategy for avoiding conflict into a proactive commitment to justice, equality, and the flourishing of all? How should education cultivate not only civic literacy but moral judgment and empathy so that citizens can navigate complex moral landscapes with discernment and virtue? We must also acknowledge the possibility of new questions that governance and education confront in a post-industrial, digital, and globally interlinked world. How do we think about freedom of expression and the risk of harm in online spaces where misinformation and harassment can threaten the democratic process? How can toleration be robust in the face of demands for greater accountability from communities that have historically been silenced or marginalized? How can property be reconceived in an era of resource scarcity, environmental limits, and social inequality so that ownership does not become a weapon of exclusion? In these questions, Locke's core commitments remain a compass, but the terrain requires that compass to adapt to new climates. We should also bring back the essential voices to show the chain of thought, from Locke to Mill to Kant to Rawls to Nozick to contemporary debates on education and religion, so that the continuity is visible, but the conversation remains alive. When Mill writes that liberty must be defended against the tyranny of the majority, he is continuing Locke's effort to protect conscience and autonomy, but he is also insisting that liberty requires a robust limit on social coercion beyond the mere endorsement of property rights. Kant's imperative deepens our obligations. We must treat humanity as an end in itself, not as a means to a political project. Nozick's critique presses us to ask where rights end and state aims begin. The risk of overreach, the danger of coercive redistribution, and the defense of individual sovereignty in a world that demands collective solutions. Rawls's theory adds a social dimension that is hard to ignore. Even with a state that protects basic liberties, we must design social institutions so that the least advantaged have a fair opportunity to participate, thrive, and contribute. In this reflective moment, we pause to consider a few more historical anecdotes that illuminate how Locke's thought traveled and transformed. One anecdote speaks to the reception of Locke's ideas by early American leaders and writers. The way in which his theories quietly informed the writing of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and more broadly, the framing of the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and their contemporaries were steeped in the English liberal tradition, a tradition that did not treat liberty as the mere absence of restraint, but as a positive condition of human flourishing that requires institutions, laws, and practices to support the exercise of reason and the rule of law. The second anecdote concerns the way Locke's thought traveled across Europe and into the Atlantic world. In the Dutch Republic, his arguments about toleration resonated with a society that valued religious diversity and intellectual exchange. The letters, pamphlets, and translations that passed through Amsterdam and The Hague carried Lockean language toward the British Isles and across the Atlantic, where it would help shape debates about church establishment, civil liberty, and colonial governance. The Atlantic voyage of Locke's ideas is a reminder that philosophical claims do not stay contained within a single nation or a single moment. They migrate, adapt, and reappear in new forms amid different political landscapes and social struggles. With these reflections in view, we turn again to the practice of critical engagement with primary texts in the present moment. If we read Locke with attention to his time and his aims, we can appreciate his ambition to secure a civil peace built on rational consent, the rule of law, and a public sphere where persons might dissent, think differently, and pursue their own good. If we read him alongside Mill, Kant, Nozick, and Rawls, we can see a conversation that remains unfinished, a tradition that continues to be asked to justify itself and to revise itself in light of new questions of justice, equality, and human dignity. And if we read him in dialogue with feminist and post-colonial critiques, we understand that liberal thought is not immune to self-critique. It must be tested by the demands of universal human rights, the recognition of historical injustices, and the need to address power and domination wherever they appear. Before we close this segment, let us circle back to the question that anchors the entire discussion. How does Locke's legacy, his emphasis on liberty, toleration, and educational formation, still matter in a world of contested public life? The answer is not a single verdict, but a set of ongoing commitments. It is the commitment to a political order grounded in consent, but consent that must be enriched by the voices of those historically excluded. It is the commitment to tolerance that is not a cover for indifference, but a practice of listening, dissent, and conversation that keeps civil life alive. It is the commitment to education that sees schools as the training ground for citizens who can think clearly, feel deeply, and act with moral seriousness in service of the common good. It is also the willingness to hear critiques born of experience, power, and history, the feminist, the colonial, the post-colonial, the postmodern, so that liberalism does not remain a set of abstract rights but becomes a living obligation to create a more just and inclusive order. And so we return to the living room of this dialogue, with a closing sequence of reflective questions for you, the viewer, to carry forward as you digest the long tradition of liberal thought and its modern revision. If consent is the bedrock of legitimate political authority, how can we ensure that consent is genuinely inclusive, informed, and enduring, not simply a formal permission granted by those already in power? If toleration is the path to civil peace, what are the practices that we must adopt to transform toleration into justice for those who have faced systemic discrimination? If education is the engine of liberty, how can schools be designed to cultivate the capacity to think and to care, to question and to act, in ways that respect difference while nurturing common humanity? If the property that grounds the Lockean state is to be preserved, what responsibilities accompany ownership when the resources of the earth and the rights of communities against dispossession are at stake? If we have inherited a tradition that claims to respect rational agents, what forms of dialogue, accountability, and reform do we owe to those whose voices have long been muted in the corridors of power? In the end, the Locke who speaks through the centuries is not a single, fixed voice but a living conversation partner. He invites us to hold fast to reasonable liberty and to defend it against the temptations of coercion, fear, and cynicism. He invites us to take seriously the duties that accompany rights, the duties to think, to reason, to engage with others, and to act with compassion. He invites us to consider how education can shape citizens who are not only free and curious, but morally attuned to the needs and rights of others. And he invites us to face the persistent challenges of power, history, and inequality with the stubborn hope that a better form of political life is not only possible, but achievable through patient, principled labor. If you have listened with care, you have perhaps felt the tremor of a question that has moved through the ages. Can liberty endure in a world of deep differences and enduring injustices, or does liberty itself demand a more generous and more demanding justice? The dialogue is ongoing, and the answer lies not in one grand syllogism, but in the patient cultivation of a public life in which reason, civility, education, and care for others guide our most consequential choices. The legacy of Locke invites us to be both guardians and critics of liberalism, to defend the space in which minds may be free, and to keep the doors open to those who seek a fuller realization of human dignity in a shared, diverse, and imperfect world. Let us close by recalling the perennial thread that ties these inquiries together, a political theory that refuses to petrify into dogma, and a pedagogy that refuses to petrify into rote. Liberty, education, and toleration are not mere abstract ideals. They are practical claims about how we live together, how we teach our children, and how we structure our public institutions so that they serve the dignity of every person. The path forward is not to abandon Locke, but to carry him forward with humility, to test his claims against history's revisions, and to enrich the tradition with the honest voices of those who challenge it. In the quiet, in the space between breaths, we listen for wisdom that belongs to all of us, the patient voice that knows that liberty is a living project, not a fixed trophy, and that justice demands more than consent. It requires care, attention, and constant renewal through education, dialogue, and democratic practice.